The morning arrived not with a sound, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible change in the quality of the darkness. In another year, in another version of this town, the day would have been announced by the shriek of the textile mill whistle echoing down the valley, or the heavy rumble of the freight train slowing for the junction switch. But those sounds had stopped. Not with a bang or a declaration, but simply by fading away until one morning they were no longer a part of the fabric of waking life. The whistle remained silent because the mill gates were chained, its tall brick chimney standing against the grey sky like a cold monument to noise that had ceased to exist. The train still passed sometimes, but it did so at unpredictable hours and with fewer cars clattering behind the engine, its whistle a single low moan rather than an insistent call to labour. This particular Tuesday, like many Tuesdays before it in the early part of the decade, began in a pocket of profound quiet that seemed to press against the window glass like a held breath. You might have found yourself in a room on the second floor of a house that sat squarely on its foundation, a house that had seen better paint and tighter window sashes. The ceiling above the iron bedstead was cracked in a pattern that resembled the delta of a slow river, a tributary of fine lines branching out from the central light fixture which held a single bulb of low wattage, now dark and cold. The plaster had swelled slightly in one corner where a leak from 3 winters ago had left a watermark shaped vaguely like the continent of South America, a pale yellow-brown shape on the whitewash. Your awareness of this ceiling was not a new observation, but an old familiarity, something you had studied on countless mornings while waiting for the room to warm enough to justify throwing back the layers of quilt and wool blanket. The warmth never came easily now. The furnace in the basement was fed a lean diet of dusty bituminous coal and slack, the cheapest grade available, which burned with a lazy orange flame and produced more soot than heat. The cast-iron radiators clicked and sighed occasionally, but they remained mostly lukewarm to the touch, a condition that required the sleeper to burrow into a nest of bedding like a field mouse in a hedgerow. The light that filtered through the single window, a pane of glass that was slightly wavy and contained a single trapped air bubble the size of a pea, was thin and grey. It was the light of a sun that had not yet decided if it would bother to burn through the overcast layer that had settled over the valley like a lid on a pot. This light moved across the floor with an agonizing slowness that was imperceptible in the moment, but noticeable if you happened to glance away and then look back a quarter of an hour later. It crept across the worn linoleum rug, a patterned floor covering in shades of brown and ochre that had been fashionable when it was laid down during the Coolidge administration. The pattern was a geometric maze of interlocking squares, and the morning light would first illuminate the square nearest the window, then slowly, over the span of 40 minutes or more, advance to the next square and the one after that, in a quiet, daily procession that was as reliable as the turning of the earth. You could trace the path of this light with your eyes, noting the way it highlighted a thin scratch in the linoleum where a chair leg had scraped it 1,000 times, or the small, smooth depression worn into the surface right where bare feet landed when getting out of bed. The act of leaving the warmth of the blankets was a negotiation conducted without words. You would test the air temperature by extending one hand from beneath the pile of covers, holding it palm up toward the ceiling as if checking for rain. The air was sharp enough to make the knuckles feel stiff. Your fingers would retreat back into the safety of the wall, and you would lie there for another count of 200 breaths, listening to the sound of your own breathing and the absolute absence of any other noise. There was no clatter of milk trucks, no rumble of a neighbor's Ford starting up to go to a job that no longer existed, no sound of children running to school because it was summer and the schools were closed for the season anyway. But even if they had been open, the children in this neighborhood walked with a quiet, shuffling gait these days, their shoes too thin to make much noise on the pavement. Eventually, the need to begin the day's small rituals outweighed the comfort of the bed. You would throw back the covers in a single decisive movement, letting the cold air rush over your flannel nightclothes, and you would swing your legs over the side of the mattress, placing your feet squarely on that warm spot on the linoleum. The floor was cold, a fact that registered through the thinning soles of your wool socks. You would sit there for a moment, the edge of the iron bed frame pressing a line into the back of your thighs, and you would look down at your own feet. The socks had been darned so many times that the original yarn was barely visible. They were a patchwork of different shades of grey and brown wool, a testament to the contents of the mending basket that sat in the corner of the front room. You would wiggle your toes, watching the fabric stretch and relax, and then you would stand up. The motion was slow, not from infirmity, but from a natural economy of movement that had become second nature. There was no need to rush. The day ahead was a long, flat expanse of hours to be filled with small tasks, and none of them required haste. Dressing was a ceremony conducted in near silence. The clothes were kept in a tall, narrow wardrobe made of dark wood that smelled faintly of cedar and old dust. When you opened the door, the hinges made a small, high-pitched whine that was the loudest sound in the room so far that day. Inside hung a modest collection of garments, all of them showing signs of careful repair. A work shirt of blue chambray had a collar that had been turned and restitched to hide the frayed edge. The fabric was soft from hundreds of washings and had faded to a pale sky blue, except under the arms where the color remained slightly darker, protected from the sun. A pair of trousers made of heavy cotton twill hung from a wooden hanger, the crease down the front long since surrendered to the shape of the wearer's legs. There was a patch sewn over the left knee, secured with tiny precise stitches that were almost invisible unless you looked closely. The thread used for the patch was a shade darker than the original fabric, a near match discovered in the bottom of a sewing box that had once belonged to a grandmother. You would take these items down and lay them on the unmade bed, smoothing out the wrinkles with the flat of your hand. The act of buttoning the shirt was a series of small, methodical movements. The buttons were made of white milk glass, some of them chipped at the edges, but they slipped through the worn buttonholes with a familiar ease. You would tuck the shirt into the waistband of the trousers and cinch the belt. A strip of leather that had been punched with an extra hole, using a nail to accommodate a narrower waist than the belt had originally been designed for. The descent to the first floor was a journey down a narrow staircase that was entirely enclosed, creating a passageway of dim, dusty air. The steps were covered with a runner of faded carpet that had once been burgundy, but was now a uniform shade of dusty rose, held in place by brass rods that had lost their shine decades ago. The seventh step from the top had a particular creak, a low groan that sounded exactly in the middle of the tread, and you would automatically step to the far right side of that step to avoid it. It was an unconscious adjustment, a habit born of years of navigating this house in the dark, or while carrying a sleeping child who was no longer small. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a small hallway with a door leading to the front room on the left and an arched opening to the kitchen straight ahead. The kitchen was the true heart of the house now, not because of the warmth of a roaring fire, but because it was the place where the day's most essential and time-consuming activity took place, the preparation of food from a limited and carefully managed supply. The kitchen floor was covered in a different pattern of linoleum, this one a checkered design of cream and faded red squares. It was clean, swept free of any crumbs, because crumbs were not wasted, but rather collected and saved for the birds, or, in the leanest weeks, added to a pan of cornbread to give it a little more substance. The cast-iron stove, a large heavy presence against the far wall, was already warm. The firebox had been banked the night before with a careful arrangement of coal dust and small lumps, and it had smouldered through the darkness, keeping the chill just far enough at bay to prevent the water pipes from freezing. You would open the small door on the front of the stove and peer inside at the faint orange glow buried under a layer of grey ash. With a long-handled poker, you would gently stir the embers, causing a small flare of warmth to touch your face. Then you would add a few small sticks of kindling, split from an old shipping crate found behind the general store, and a handful of the dusty coal. The kindling caught with a soft whoosh, and the fire began to perk up, its new appetite drawing a thin stream of air through the damper. Breakfast was not a meal of abundance, but a ritual of resourcefulness. On the counter sat a loaf of bread baked 3 days prior, now wrapped in a clean, slightly dampened tea towel to keep it from becoming too hard. You would unwrap it carefully, noting the weight of the loaf in your hand. It was denser than bread used to be, made with a portion of cornmeal and a scant amount of yeast to stretch the more expensive white flour. You would use a long, serrated knife to cut 2 slices, angling the blade carefully to make them even and thin. The act of sawing through the crust produced a soft, rhythmic rasping sound and a shower of tiny crumbs that you would sweep into the palm of your hand and drop into the sink for later. The slices were placed on a wire rack set over the open eye of the stove to toast. You would stand there watching them, turning them once with a fork when the edges began to curl and darken. The smell of toasting bread filled the kitchen. a smell that was both comforting and slightly melancholic because it was the same smell that had filled this kitchen in times of plenty, but now it was accompanied by the knowledge that the loaf was one of only two left. From the pantry, a small closet lined with shelves made of bare pine, you retrieved a glass jar of preserves. The jar was a mason jar with a zinc lid lined with milk glass. The contents were a deep, dark purple, almost black, and they shifted thickly when you tilted the jar. It was wild grape jam, made the previous autumn from grapes gathered along the fence rows at the edge of town, an area where the land was too rocky to plow, but where the wild vines thrived. The process of making that jam had been a long, hot afternoon of boiling and stirring, and now this jar was one of the last of that batch. You would unscrew the lid, which released a small pop of air and a faintly sweet, tart scent. Using a clean spoon, you would scoop out a small amount, barely enough to cover the blade, and spread it thin across the surface of the warm toast. The jam melted slightly, seeping into the porous bread, and the combined warmth was a small, quiet pleasure in the cold kitchen. You would eat standing at the counter, looking out the window over the sink. The window faced the backyard, a rectangular plot of grass that was now mostly brown and dormant, and beyond that, the empty lot where the Peterson house had stood before it burned down 3 winters ago. The view was of a straggly line of sumac bushes turning red at the edges, and a grey sky that seemed to stretch on forever. The toast was chewy and slightly sour, the jam intensely sweet. You would eat slowly, taking small bites and chewing thoroughly, because there was no second piece waiting, and the act of eating was something to be extended rather than hurried. When the toast was finished, you would run a finger over the plate to catch the last smear of purple jam and lick it clean. Then you would fill the kettle with water from the hand pump at the sink, the pump handle groaning with each downward stroke until the water gushed out, cold and clear, splashing against the speckled enamel interior of the kettle. You would set it on the stove to heat for a cup of weak tea made from leaves that had already been steeped once the day before, dried carefully on a saucer, and saved for a second, paler use. The rest of the morning stretched out ahead, a vast and empty landscape of hours. There were tasks to do, of course. The mending basket awaited, a pile of worn socks and shirts with frayed cuffs. The garden needed weeding, though the weeds were growing slowly in the dry, cool weather. The front room could be dusted, though it never seemed to get very dusty because no one came in and out, and the windows were kept shut against the chill. But for now, as the thin tea steeped to a pale amber color and the light from the window crept another inch across the kitchen floor, there was only the stillness. It was a stillness that had a texture and a weight, a quiet so deep you could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the next room, the whisper of the coals settling in the stove, and, from somewhere far away, the lonely distant sound of a single crow calling out across the empty fields. The sound came, and then it went, leaving behind a silence that seemed even larger than before, a silence that was the true sound of the world. Now, the sound of waiting, the sound of getting by, the sound of a morning in a year that had no name for what was to come next. The kitchen was not merely a room for the preparation of meals, it was the counting house of a new and quieter economy. In the absence of regular pay envelopes and the cheerful jingle of coins in a pocket, value had migrated to the shelves and cupboards, to the burlap sacks and glass jars that lined the walls of the pantry. This small unlit closet, off the back of the kitchen, had become a vault of sorts, its contents catalogued not on paper ledgers, but in the careful, habitual glances of the person who opened its door each day. You knew exactly how many potatoes remained in the wooden bin because you had counted them with your eyes the last time you reached in, noting the ones that had begun to sprout pale, knobby eyes and moving them to the front to be used next. You knew the level of the rolled oats in the tall tin canister by the sound it made when you tilted it slightly, a soft, sandy whisper that indicated there was perhaps enough for 2 more weeks of porridge if you measured with a light hand. This knowledge was not a source of anxiety but a form of quiet competence, a familiarity with the physical boundaries of one's world that was, in its own way, as reassuring as a full bank book had once been. The pantry door itself was a plain panel of wood, painted many layers of white, now chipped and yellowed with age. It stuck slightly in the jam during damp weather and swung freely when the air was dry, and you had learned to gauge the humidity of the day, by the amount of pressure required to pull it open. On this particular afternoon, it opened with only a slight resistance, revealing the dim interior that smelled of burlap, dried herbs, and the faint earthy scent of potatoes, doing their slow work of converting starch to sugar in the dark. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling on a twisted cloth cord, and you would reach up and turn the small ridged knob at its base. The light that came on was weak and slightly orange, casting long shadows behind the jars and boxes that crowded the shelves. This light was used sparingly, only for the duration of the task at hand, and then it was clicked off again, plunging the pantry back into its natural state of patient darkness. The shelves themselves were simple planks of pine, unfinished and unadorned, supported by metal brackets that had been screwed into the studs of the wall. They had absorbed the odors of the things stored upon them for so long that if you were to press your nose to the raw wood, you might detect a ghost of cinnamon from a decade ago or the sharp, pleasant sting of vinegar from last summer's pickling marathon. The lowest shelf held the heaviest items, a practical arrangement born of necessity and the fear of a shelf collapsing in the middle of the night. Here sat a large stoneware crock with a wooden lid, inside of which was a supply of salt, coarse and greyish, used for preserving and for the heavy scrubbing of pots. Next to it was a 25-pound sack of white flour, its cotton fabric soft and finely dusted with a pale film that transferred to your hands whenever you lifted it. The sack was not as full as it had been when it arrived from the relief office, or was purchased with the last of the egg money. It had a slumped, settled look, its sides curving inward where the flour had been scooped away week after week. Beside the flour sat a smaller sack of yellow cornmeal, its texture grittier and its color a cheerful sunny contrast to the pale flour and the grey salt. You would sometimes run your fingers over the rough weave of the sack and think of the field where the corn had grown, a field somewhere far to the west where the soil was black and deep, and where the rains had been more generous than they were here. The middle shelf was the domain of the mason jars. They stood in rows like a small glass army, their contents preserved in shades of amber, jade, and ruby. There were jars of green beans, the pods cut into uniform 1-inch length and packed so tightly they seemed to be holding each other up, the water inside them slightly cloudy from the pressure canning process. There were jars of tomatoes, whole and peeled, floating in their own red juice, and when you held one up to the light, you could see the faint outline of the seeds suspended within the flesh. There were jars of sweet pickle relish, a confetti of green and red peppers in a sweet vinegary syrup that would be spooned sparingly onto beans, or a slice of bread to provide a flash of brightness on a cold day. There were a few remaining jars of peaches from the tree in the side yard that had produced a bumper crop 2 summers ago, the golden crescents of fruit looking like captured sunlight against the dark glass. Each jar was a small testament to a hot afternoon spent over a boiling canna, the kitchen windows fogged with steam, and the air thick with the smell of vinegar and sugar, and the metallic tang of the jar lids sealing with a satisfying pop. The highest shelf was the most miscellaneous, a catch-all for the odds and ends that defied easy categorization but were far too precious to discard. A small paper bag of dried navy beans rustled softly when you touched it. A tin of baking powder, its label faded to a pale blue, sat next to a box of baking soda that did double duty for leavening biscuits and for scrubbing the kitchen sink. There was a glass jar of loose tea leaves, the cheapest grade available, which produced a brew the color of pale straw and tasted faintly of the paper box it had come in. And there, pushed to the back, were the true treasures, a small bottle of vanilla extract, its contents a dark, potent liquid that was used by the drop rather than the teaspoon, and a squat jar of molasses, thick and black, with a label bearing the image of a smiling woman holding a pitcher. The molasses was the primary sweetener, now that sugar was a luxury measured by the half-cup, and its strong mineral flavor had become the defining note of many a simple dessert. The inventory of the pantry was not a static thing. It was a living, breathing document that changed slightly with each passing day. You would stand before these shelves in the quiet of the afternoon, not to take anything necessarily, but simply to look. It was a form of meditation, a way of reassuring yourself that the walls of this small room still contained a means to carry on for another week, another month. Your gaze would travel from the slumped flour sack to the neat rows of green beans, from the jar of molasses to the burlap bag of potatoes on the floor. The potatoes were stored in a bin made of wooden slats, which allowed the air to circulate around them and prevented rot. When you lifted the lid, a cool, damp, earthy smell rose up, and you could see the pale, ghostly sprouts reaching upward toward a light that never came. You would reach in and select the potatoes that had sprouted the most, breaking off the soft white growths with your thumbnail before dropping the tuber into the pocket of your apron or the crook of your arm. These would be the potatoes for tonight's soup. The making of a pot of soup intended to last for 3 days was a slow, deliberate process that began in the early afternoon. It was a task that required no recipe, no measuring cups, only the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 meals prepared under similar circumstances. You would take a large, heavy pot from its hook on the wall, a pot of blue speckled enamel with a black handle and a lid that fit snugly. The inside of the pot was stained a permanent brown from years of simmering broths and stews, a patina that no amount of scrubbing with baking soda could remove, and that you had ceased to notice long ago. The pot was placed on the stove over a low flame, and into it went a small lump of saved fat, a spoonful of drippings from a piece of salt pork that had been used days ago to flavor a pot of beans. The fat melted slowly, spreading across the bottom of the pot in a thin, shimmering layer. From the pantry, you would retrieve a single limp carrot. It had been stored in a box of sand in the cellar, a method that kept it from drying out completely, but the long months of winter had taken their toll. The carrot was slightly rubbery, its skin wrinkled, and its bright orange color faded to a pale, dusty hue. You would lay it on the wooden cutting board and, using a small, sharp knife, trim away the top and the wispy dried root at the bottom. The peelings were thin, barely more than a suggestion, because to peel a carrot thickly in this kitchen was an act of waste that bordered on the unthinkable. The peelings themselves were saved in a small bowl to be added to the stock for flavor and then strained out later. The carrot was then diced into small, even cubes, the knife making a soft, rhythmic thumping sound against the board. Each cube was about the size of a fingernail, and the pile that accumulated on the board was modest, a small orange mound that would have to flavor a very large pot of water. An onion was next, a yellow onion that had hung in a mesh bag from a nail in the cellar stairs. Its outer skin was papery and rustled when you touched it, and beneath that the layers were firm and pungent. Cutting the onion made your eyes sting and water, a familiar sensation that caused you to turn your head away and blink rapidly at the window. The diced onion joined the carrot on the cutting board, a pale, translucent pile next to the orange one. Sometimes, if there was a stalk of celery left from the bunch that had been wrapped in damp newspaper in the bottom of the icebox, you would add that as well, the pale green ribs providing a fresh, clean scent that cut through the heavier smells of the kitchen. But on this day, there was no celery. The last stalk had been used 2 days ago to add a bit of crunch to a sandwich made of bread and a thin scraping of potted meat. The absence of celery was noted and accepted, and the soup would be made without it. The diced vegetables were scraped from the board into the pot, where they landed in the hot fat with a soft, satisfying sizzle. You would stir them with the long-handled wooden spoon, the same spoon that had stirred 1,000 pots before this one, its bowl worn down on one side from years of scraping the curved bottom of the pot. The vegetables softened slowly, their colors brightening for a moment before mellowing into a uniform pale gold. The smell that rose from the pot was the foundational smell of cooking, the smell of alliums and root vegetables releasing their moisture into the hot fat, a smell that promised sustenance and warmth. You would stand at the stove, stirring slowly and watching the vegetables change, and the rhythm of the spoon against the enamel was a steady, calming beat. When the vegetables were soft and translucent, you would add the water. The water came from the hand pump at the sink, cold and clear, and you would fill the pot until it was nearly full. The sizzling stopped, replaced by a brief silence, and then the gentle sound of water beginning to heat. Then you would go back to the pantry and retrieve the most important ingredient, the thing that would give the soup its body and its name. It was a bone. The bone was a ham bone, or a beef shank bone, or perhaps the remains of a chicken carcass that had been picked clean of every last shred of meat. It was stored in a small covered dish in the icebox, waiting for this exact purpose. You would carry it to the pot and lower it gently into the water, watching it sink to the bottom and settle among the diced vegetables. There was almost no meat left on it, just a few tough, stringy bits of gristle and a small pocket of marrow deep within the knobby end. But that was enough. That was the magic of the soup pot, the alchemy that transformed water and a bare bone into something that could fill a stomach and provide a measure of comfort. A small handful of dried beans from the paper bag on the top shelf was rinsed and added. A single bay leaf, dry and brittle, was placed on top of the water where it floated like a tiny brown boat. A pinch of the coarse grey salt from the stoneware crock was sprinkled in, followed by a grinding of black pepper from a small tin grinder that had been a wedding gift long ago. The pepper grinder made a rasping sound as you twisted it, and the fine black dust fell onto the surface of the water and slowly dispersed. Then you would place the lid on the pot, slightly askew to allow a wisp of steam to escape, and you would step back. The rest of the afternoon was a lesson in patience. The soup needed to simmer, not boil. A hard, rolling boil would make the broth cloudy and tough, and it would waste precious fuel. So you would adjust the damper on the stove, reducing the flame to a low blue flicker that was barely visible beneath the pot. The water inside would move in a slow, lazy circle, a single large bubble rising to the surface every few seconds and breaking with a soft plop. The sound was a gentle, intermittent murmur, a sound that filled the kitchen and seeped into the other rooms of the house, a sound that said, "All is well, all is being taken care of, there is food in the pot." You would find other tasks to occupy your hands during this long simmer. A pile of mending that needed attention, a floor that could use a sweep, a window that needed washing with vinegar and old newspaper. But your ear was always tuned to the sound of the pot, and your nose was always aware of the changing fragrance in the air. As the hours passed, the smell of the soup deepened and grew more complex. The initial sharpness of the onion mellowed into a sweet, round note. The earthiness of the carrot and the mineral tang of the bone joined in, creating a scent that was at once humble and deeply satisfying. The steam that escaped from the pot was moist and warm, and it condensed on the cool glass of the kitchen window, creating a small foggy patch through which the grey afternoon light filtered softly. You would lift the lid occasionally, using a folded dish towel to protect your hand from the hot handle, and peer inside. The water had taken on a pale golden hue. The beans had swelled and softened. The bay leaf had unfurled slightly and was now drifting in the slow current. The bone, once pale and dry, had darkened and seemed to have released a faint sheen of goodness into the surrounding liquid. You would stir the pot gently with the worn wooden spoon, feeling no resistance from the bottom, and then replace the lid, letting the quiet work continue. This pot of soup represented not just a meal, but a system of careful management. The first night, it would be served as a clear broth with a few pieces of vegetable and perhaps a slice of the day's bread on the side. The second night, after the pot had cooled and been stored in the icebox overnight, the flavors would have melded further, and you might add a handful of noodles made from flour and water and rolled thin on the kitchen table, cut into strips with a knife. These noodles would cook in the reheated broth, absorbing the flavor and adding a bit of substance. By the third day, the soup would be thicker, the beans having broken down slightly to create a velvety texture, and the last bits of marrow from the bone would have dissolved into the liquid. On that final day, you might scrape the last of the jam jar into the pot for a hint of sweetness, or add a few wild greens gathered from the edge of the yard, dandelion leaves or young lamb's quarters, chopped fine and wilted in the hot broth. There was no waste in this economy. The bone, once it had given all it could, would be removed and saved for the stock pot next time, or if it was truly spent, it would be buried in the garden to add its remaining minerals to the soil. The vegetable peels and trimmings that had been saved in the bowl would be taken out to the small compost pile behind the shed, where they would slowly return to the earth, becoming food for next year's garden. As the afternoon light began to fade into the grey of early evening, you would return to the stove and turn the flame up just slightly, bringing the soup to a more active simmer. The aroma intensified, filling the kitchen with a warmth that seemed to push back against the chill seeping in around the window frames. You would take down 2 bowls from the cupboard, simple white ironstone bowls with a thin blue line around the rim. They were heavy and sturdy, designed for daily use and for surviving the occasional drop onto the linoleum floor. The ladle hung from a hook near the stove, its bowl deep and round. You would lift the lid of the pot one final time, and a cloud of fragrant steam would billow up. warming your face. Dipping the ladle into the golden broth, you would fill the first bowl, careful to include a few carrots, a few beans, and a small piece of the softened onion. The liquid settled in the bowl, its surface shimmering slightly, and a single small circle of fat floated on top, catching the light from the window. You would carry the bowl to the kitchen table and sit down, the wood of the chair creaking under your weight, and you would lift a spoonful of the broth to your lips. The taste was mild, savory, and warm. It tasted of the pantry shelf, of the careful accounting, of the quiet hours of simmering. It tasted like enough, and in this kitchen, in this year, enough was a quiet victory. A small, warm bowl of sustenance that carried with it the promise of tomorrow. The long, flat hours of the afternoon had a quality all their own, a texture that was different from the grey promise of morning or the settling darkness of evening. After the midday meal, which was often nothing more than a slice of bread and a cup of the weak tea, the house seemed to exhale and grow still, as if it too recognized that there was nowhere to go and nothing that demanded immediate attention. The sun, when it chose to appear from behind the perpetual overcast, would climb to its highest point in the southern sky and then seem to pause there, hanging motionless while the shadows beneath the furniture shrank to small dark pools. This was the hour of the mending basket, a time-honored ritual that occupied the hands while leaving the mind free to wander down the quiet, unmarked paths of memory or simply to rest in a state of calm, waking suspension. The mending basket sat in its accustomed place on the floor beside the armchair in the front room, a chair positioned to catch the best of the afternoon light from the single west-facing window. The basket itself was an object of humble utility, a round, deep vessel woven from strips of brown ash splint, its rim bound with a heavier piece of wood that had been worn smooth by years of being lifted and carried from room to room. The weave was tight and even, the work of someone who had learned the craft in another century, and the interior was lined with a faded piece of calico fabric, printed with tiny blue flowers on a cream background, a scrap left over from a dress sewn long before the current quiet had settled over the land. The basket had a single handle, an arched loop of the same ash splint that rose from opposite sides of the rim, and this handle had developed a dark, glossy patina from the oils of the hand that lifted it day after day. To look inside the mending basket was to see a small museum of the family's physical history, a collection of worn edges and frayed hems that told the story of the past year without the need for words. The contents were not jumbled or chaotic, but rather arranged in a loose order, the items that needed the most immediate attention resting on top, while those that could wait a while longer lay deeper down. On this particular afternoon, the topmost item was a man's work sock, a tube of knitted wool in a shade that might once have been a dark forest green, but had faded over many washings to a pale, silvery sage. The heel of the sock was worn through, a hole the size of a silver dollar exposing the white cotton lining beneath, and the edges of the hole were thin and fragile, threatening to unravel further with each passing day. Beside the sock lay its mate, not yet worn through, but showing a pale, thin spot in the exact same location, a preview of the work that would soon be required. The socks were made of a sturdy yarn that had a slight scratchiness to it, a quality that was not unpleasant, but rather spoke of durability and warmth, and they had been knitted by someone whose tension was even and sure, the rows of stitches marching in orderly lines up the leg and around the foot. Beneath the socks was a shirt of blue chambray, the same shirt that had been taken from the wardrobe that morning and worn for a few hours before being returned to the basket, when a small tear was discovered near the cuff. The tear was a straight, clean rip about an inch long, the result of catching the sleeve on a protruding nail in the door frame of the pantry, and the fabric around it was slightly stressed but not frayed. The shirt was soft and pliable from canvas washings, and it carried the faint, clean scent of lye soap and the sun, a smell that was released whenever the fabric was moved. Folded beneath the shirt was a pillowcase made of plain white cotton, its hem coming undone along one side so that the folded edge hung loose and floppy. There was also a small pile of handkerchiefs, squares of thin, soft cotton that had once been white, but were now a uniform shade of ecru, each one bearing a tiny monogram embroidered in pale blue thread in the corner. The handkerchiefs were worn thin in the center, the fabric there almost transparent, and they would soon need to be cut down into smaller squares for cleaning eyeglasses or dusting delicate surfaces. A second life for an object that had served its first purpose faithfully. The tools of the mending trade were kept in a separate, smaller container that nestled inside the larger basket. This was a round wooden box with a fitted lid, its surface painted with a faded design of roses and forget-me-nots. The paint crackled into a fine network of lines like the surface of an old oil painting. When the lid was removed, it revealed a tidy collection of necessities. There were spools of thread in a modest array of colors, a spool of black for the heavy mending of trousers and coats, a spool of white for linens and underthings, a spool of navy blue that was a near match for the faded chambray shirt, and a spool of a peculiar shade of brownish-grey shirt, and a spool of a peculiar shade of brownish-grey that seemed to blend with almost anything. The thread was not the fine glossy mercerized cotton of the department store, but a sturdier, slightly fuzzy variety that came on wooden spools with paper labels that were peeling at the corners. Alongside the spools was a small, flat tin that had once held peppermint lozenges and now contained an assortment of needles pushed into a folded piece of flannel. The needles were of various sizes and thicknesses, from a fine, sharp one for delicate work to a heavier, blunt-tipped darning needle with a large eye that could accommodate the thick wool yarn used for mending socks. There was also a tomato-shaped pincushion, a classic object of mid-century domestic life. The body of the tomato was made of red velveteen, now faded and worn to a soft, dusty rose color in the spots where fingers had gripped it most often. The green felt leaves at the top were slightly frayed at the edges, and the small loop of green thread that was meant to hold a tiny emery strawberry had long since broken off, leaving only a bare knot. The pincushion was plump and heavy, densely packed with sawdust or fine sand that gave it a satisfying weight in the hand, and it was bristling with pins. There were straight pins with small round heads of colored glass in shades of cobalt blue, ruby red, and amber yellow, and there were larger safety pins of various sizes. Their silver metal, dulled with age and handling. A small pair of scissors completed the collection, their blades short and sharp, their handles two simple loops of unadorned metal. The scissors had been used for so many years that the pivot screw was slightly loose, causing the blades to wobble ever so slightly when they were opened and closed, but they still cut thread with a clean, decisive snip. The act of mending began with the selection of the day's project. On this afternoon, the sock with the hole in the heel was the most urgent item, so it was lifted from the basket and the other items were set aside. You would reach into the depths of the basket and retrieve a smooth, egg-shaped object made of polished hardwood. This was the darning egg, a tool specifically designed for the task at hand. Its surface was warm and silky from years of use, the wood having absorbed the oils of countless hands and the faint lanolin from the wool of countless socks. The egg was inserted into the sock and pushed down into the heel, stretching the worn fabric taut and providing a firm, curved surface against which to work. The hole was now presented as a clean, round opening, its edges held firmly in place and ready to receive the new thread. You would select the darning needle from the wooden box and thread it with a length of yarn that had been saved from the original knitting of the socks, a small ball of the silvery sage wool that had been tucked into the bottom of the mending basket for just this purpose. The yarn was slightly thinner than it had been when new, having been handled and wound and unwound many times, but it was still strong and pliable. The needle was pushed through the fabric a short distance from the edge of the hole, and the slow, rhythmic work of darning began. The needle moved over and under the strands of the existing knit, creating a new web of yarn that gradually covered the bare spot. The motion was a simple, repetitive one. Up through the fabric, pull the yarn through, down through the fabric a short distance away, pull the yarn through. Over and over, the needle dipped and rose, the yarn following in its wake like a tiny, silent river of green. The sound was almost non-existent, just the faintest whisper of wool rubbing against wool and the soft click of the needle's tip against the wooden egg. This work required no great concentration. The hands knew what to do, having performed this same task hundreds of times before, and the mind was free to drift. You might find yourself looking up from the work and gazing out the window beside the chair. The window looked out onto the street, a quiet, dusty lane that ran straight and flat past the front of the house. In another time, This street would have been busy in the afternoon, with the coming and going of delivery wagons and the footsteps of neighbors running errands. Now it was almost always empty. The pavement was cracked in places, and small tufts of grass and weeds had pushed up through the fissures, creating a miniature landscape of green against the grey asphalt. A single automobile might pass by in the course of an hour, a battered Ford or Chevrolet moving slowly, its engine making a low, rattling sound that faded gradually into the distance, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper than before. More often, the only movement on the street was the wind, which stirred the dust into small, lazy spirals that danced for a moment on the pavement and then collapsed back into stillness. You would watch these dust devils with a detached, peaceful interest, noting how they formed and dissolved, how they seemed to have a brief, tiny life of their own, before returning to the earth from which they came. Beyond the street was the empty lot where the Peterson house had stood, a gap in the row of homes like a missing tooth. The foundation was still visible, a rectangle of crumbling stone filled with a tangle of weeds and wildflowers. Goldenrod grew there now, its tall stalks topped with feathery yellow plumes that nodded in the breeze, and a thicket of sumac had taken hold in one corner, its leaves beginning to show the first hints of red as the summer waned. The lot was a small wilderness, a pocket of untamed nature that had reclaimed a space once occupied by human habitation. Birds visited the sumac and the goldenrod, and occasionally a rabbit could be seen hopping cautiously through the weeds, pausing to sit up on its haunches and twitch its nose at the silent, empty world. Watching the lot was like watching a slow, natural clock, the changing colors of the weeds and the shifting patterns of light and shadow marking the passage of the season far more reliably than any calendar. Your gaze would return to the work in your hands. The darning was nearly complete, the whole now covered with a neat, woven patch of new yarn that blended almost seamlessly with the old. The patch was slightly thicker than the surrounding fabric, a small, sturdy reinforcement that would bear the friction of the shoe and the weight of the step. You would snip the yarn with the small scissors, leaving a short tail, and then weave the tail back into the fabric with the tip of the needle, securing it so that it would not unravel. The sock was turned right side out and held up to the light. The patch was visible as a slightly darker, denser area in the heel, but it was strong and smooth and would serve for many more months of wear. The sock was then folded and set aside on the arm of the chair, and the darning egg was returned to the bottom of the basket. The quiet hour stretched on. There was no clock in the front room to mark its passing, only the slow movement of the rectangle of sunlight across the braided rug on the floor. The rug was made of scraps of wool fabric, cut into strips and braided tightly, then coiled and stitched together into an oval. Its colors were a muted, harmonious blend of browns, grays, and faded blues, the colors of old coats and worn blankets given a second life underfoot. The sunlight inched across the rug, highlighting first one braided coil, then the next, the colors warming slightly in the direct light before fading back into shadow. The cat, a large, lazy creature of indeterminate orange tabby lineage, was stretched out full length in the center of the sunbeam, its fur glowing like burnished copper. Its sides rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, and occasionally one of its paws would twitch as if it were chasing a dream mouse through some sunny field of the imagination. The cat's presence added another layer of stillness to the room, a living creature so completely at ease that its very existence seemed to slow the passage of time. You might pick up the blue chambray shirt next, turning it over to examine the small tear near the cuff. This was a simpler job, requiring only a needle and a length of the navy blue thread. The torn edges were aligned carefully, and you would begin to stitch them together with small, even stitches that were almost invisible against the textured fabric. The needle moved in and out, each stitch a tiny bridge pulling the separated fabric back into a hole. The motion was soothing, a gentle, repetitive dance of the fingers that required just enough attention to keep the mind from wandering into any place of worry or unease, but not so much that it felt like labor. It was the perfect occupation for an afternoon that asked nothing and offered everything in the way of quiet peace. From somewhere far away, beyond the empty lot in the next street over, came the distant sound of a hammer striking wood. It was a lonely sound, a single isolated ring of metal on wood that echoed briefly and then faded, leaving no clue as to its source or purpose. Perhaps someone was repairing a fence or boarding up a window in a house that had been left empty. The sound did not repeat. It came once, hung in the air for a moment, and then was gone, swallowed by the immense silence that blanketed the town. A moment later, a dog barked, a deep, throaty sound that seemed to come from the very edge of hearing, so far away that it was almost imagined. The cat's ear twitched, a single-minute movement, but it did not open its eyes. The bark was not repeated. The world was quiet again. The mending continued. The pillowcase was next, its loose hem requiring a long line of straight, even stitches. This was the most meditative work of all, a simple running stitch that traveled the length of the fabric, the needle dipping in and out in a steady, unbroken rhythm. The white thread blended into the white cotton, and the work progressed almost without visible trace, the hem slowly closing up under your fingers. The only sound was the soft whisper of the thread being pulled through the fabric, and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling in the warmth of the afternoon sun. The house itself seemed to be breathing, a slow, deep breath that matched the rhythm of your stitching. There was a peace in this room that was not the peace of abundance or the peace of security, but the peace of acceptance, the quiet understanding that this moment, with its simple task and its soft light, was enough. It was more than enough. It was a small, perfect pocket of stillness in a world that had grown very loud in its silence. As the sun began its slow descent toward the rooftops on the other side of the street, the light in the room shifted from white to gold. The rectangle on the rug stretched and elongated, reaching toward the far wall, and the cat, sensing the change in temperature, rose, stretched its back into a high arch, and ambled away toward the kitchen in search of a cooler spot. You would finish the last few stitches on the pillowcase, tie a small, secure knot, and snip the thread. The mended items were folded neatly and placed back into the basket, which would be carried to the bedroom later to return the clothes to their proper places. The wooden sewing box was closed, its painted roses disappearing under the lid, and it was nestled back into its spot among the fabric scraps. The basket was set back on the floor beside the chair, ready for the next quiet hour, the next small tear, the next worn heel. The afternoon had passed without event, without drama, without any marker of its passing other than the small sturdy patch on the heel of a sock and the faint lingering scent of wool and dust in the warm air. And that, in this house and in this year, was a good afternoon, a quiet hour well spent in the patient, unending work of holding things together. The building that had once housed the first commercial bank and trust stood on the corner of Main Street and Ash Avenue, a location that had been the precise center of the town's commercial life for as long as anyone could remember. The structure was made of red brick, the kind that had been fired in local kilns 2 generations ago, and it rose 3 stories above the sidewalk, taller than any other building on the block except for the Masonic Lodge Hall 2 doors down. The architectural style was a modest provincial interpretation of the Romanesque revival, characterized by rounded arches above the second-story windows and a heavy, corbelled cornice of carved stone that ran along the roofline. The stone had been a pale grey when it was first set in place, but the decades of coal smoke and weather had darkened it to a uniform shade of charcoal, streaked here and there with the pale green of lichen that had found a foothold in the porous surface. The building had a presence, a solidity, that had once been intended to convey permanence and security, the unspoken promise that what was placed inside its thick walls would remain safe and undisturbed until it was needed again. The entrance to the bank was a pair of heavy doors made of oak and glass, set into a deeply recessed archway at the top of 3 wide granite steps. The granite had been worn into shallow, smooth depressions by the footsteps of countless depositors and borrowers over the span of 40 years, the stone polished to a dull gleam in the center of each tread. The brass handles on the doors were long, vertical bars that had been designed to be grasped by a full hand, and they, too, had been burnished by use, though the polishing was no longer the even, bright shine of a busy establishment, but rather a patchy, mottled surface where only the most frequently touched spots retained any luster. The upper panels of the doors were filled with frosted glass, a milky, opaque surface through which nothing could be seen except the vague, watery outline of light and shadow. On the glass, painted in gold leaf that had flaked away in small, scattered patches, were the words "First Commercial Bank" in a serifed, old-fashioned script, and below that, in smaller letters, and "Trust." The word "trust" was almost entirely gone, leaving only the faintest ghost of the letter T and the tail of the T. a detail that seemed, in retrospect, to have been a quiet prophecy. The day the bank became a quiet door was not marked by any particular event or announcement that could be recalled later. It had happened gradually, and then all at once, the way a slow leak in a roof eventually leads to a sudden collapse of the plaster ceiling. For weeks, the doors had been open for fewer hours than before, the brass plate with the hours of business having been removed from its place beside the entrance and not replaced. The tellers inside, visible through the clear glass of the interior vestibule, had seemed to move more slowly, their tasks reduced to the shuffling of papers and the occasional, desultory counting of coins that were no longer being deposited or withdrawn in any significant quantity. The great, gleaming steel door of the vault had stood open more often than it stood closed, its interior shelves and drawers visible to anyone who cared to look, and they were mostly bare, lined with green felt that was fading to a dusty olive in the absence of the currency and documents it had been designed to protect. And then one morning, a Tuesday much like any other Tuesday, the heavy oak doors did not swing inward when the hour of opening arrived. They remained shut. The frosted glass offered no glimpse of movement within. The lights behind the tall, arched windows on the second floor were extinguished and stayed that way. There was no crowd gathered on the sidewalk, no line of anxious depositors demanding their money. There was only the usual emptiness of Main Street at mid-morning, the same emptiness that had become the defining characteristic of the town's public spaces. A single automobile was parked at the curb a block away, its windshield coated with a fine film of dust that had settled overnight. A man in a worn overcoat walked past the bank without pausing, his head down, his hands in his pockets, his footsteps making a soft, scuffing sound on the dry pavement. A dog of indeterminate breed trotted across the intersection, its nose to the ground, following a scent trail that led it past the granite steps and down the alley beside the building. The quiet door was just another quiet door in the town that had grown full of them. The shoe repair shop 2 doors down had been closed since the previous autumn, its window display of leather soles and tins of polish gathering a thick layer of grey dust. The hardware store across the street had reduced its hours to 3 days a week, and even then the proprietor could often be seen sitting on a stool just inside the doorway, reading a newspaper that was several days old, waiting for a customer who rarely came. The bank's closure was, in this context, simply the final note in a long, slow diminuendo, a silence that had been approaching for a very long time and had now, at last, fully arrived. The walk home from the centre of town was a journey of about 3/4 of a mile, a distance that could be covered in 20 minutes at a leisurely pace or in 15 if there was a reason to hurry. There was never a reason to hurry. There was never a reason to hurry. The route led away from Main Street and down Ash Avenue, a wide, straight thoroughfare lined with American elm trees that had been planted 50 years earlier in a civic beautification project. The elms were tall and stately, their grey bark furrowed into deep, vertical ridges, and their branches arched over the street to form a high, vaulted canopy that was pleasant and shady in the summer months. Now, in the cooler weather, the leaves had begun to thin and change colour, and the canopy was dappled with patches of yellow and brown among the remaining green. The fallen leaves had collected in the gutters and along the edges of the sidewalks, forming small dry drifts that rustled softly when the wind moved through them, a sound that was papery and delicate, like the turning of old pages in a quiet room. The sidewalk itself was made of concrete sections, each one a square of about 4 feet on a side, separated by expansion joints filled with a black, tarry substance that had softened and bubbled in the summer heat, and was now hard and brittle. Many of the sections had cracked, the fissures running diagonally from one corner to another, and in some places the roots of the elm trees had pushed up from beneath, tilting the slabs at slight angles and creating small ridges and depressions that required a certain attentiveness to navigate without stumbling. You had walked this route so many times that your feet knew exactly where to step without any conscious thought. Your body had memorized the precise location of the lifted edge on the 3rd slab past the alley, the shallow depression in front of the White House with the green shutters, the spot where the sidewalk narrowed to pass between 2 ancient silver maples, whose trunks had grown together over the decades. Walking this path was less an act of navigation and more a form of passive meditation, the body moving through a familiar landscape while the mind rested in a state of calm, unfocused awareness. The houses that lined Ash Avenue were a mixed collection of architectural styles, most of them built between 1890 and 1910, the period of the town's first flush of prosperity. There were Queen Anne cottages with steeply pitched roofs and decorative shingles in the gables. Their paint faded to soft muted shades of grey, green and cream. There were simple folk Victorian farmhouses with square, symmetrical facades and plain, unadorned trim. Their front porches, supported by turned wooden posts that had been painted white so many times that the details of the turnings were blurred and softened. There were a few American foursquares, their cubic forms solid and unpretentious, with wide front porches and dormer windows peeking out from the hipped roofs. Every house, regardless of its style, showed signs of the same patient, ongoing struggle against the forces of time and weather. Paint was peeling in places, revealing the bare grey wood beneath. Shingles were missing from roofs, leaving small dark gaps that had been patched with pieces of tin or tar paper. Front steps sagged slightly, and porch floors sloped in one direction or another, the result of foundation stones settling over the decades. But the yards were kept neat. The grass trimmed as closely as a push mower with a dull blade could manage, and the fences, where they existed, were mended with whatever materials were at hand, a piece of wire here, a salvaged board there. The houses, like the people who lived in them, were doing their best to hold themselves together, to present a respectable face to the quiet, empty street. At the corner of Ash Avenue and 4th Street, you would pass the empty lot where the town's first public school had once stood, a wooden structure that had been torn down years ago and never replaced. The lot was now a patch of rough grass and weeds, and in the center of it, someone had erected a makeshift baseball diamond with burlap sacks for bases and a backstop made of chicken wire and old lumber. On summer evenings, the local boys would gather there for informal games, their shouts and the crack of the bat echoing through the neighborhood, a sound of youthful energy that was one of the few remaining signs of life in the town. But on this afternoon, the lot was empty, the bases lying limp and forgotten in the grass, the chicken wire backstop sagging slightly in the middle. The quiet was so complete that you could hear the buzzing of a single fly as it circled lazily around a clump of goldenrod at the edge of the lot, its drone a thin, high thread of sound woven into the larger fabric of silence. The alternative economy that had emerged in the wake of the bank's quiet door was not something that was discussed openly or analyzed in any formal way. It was simply a set of practices that had evolved naturally, organically, as people found ways to exchange goods and services without the intermediary of currency, which had become scarce and precious. This economy operated on a system of memory and obligation, of favors given and received, of small informal credits and debits that were tracked in the ledgers of the mind rather than on paper. You might give a neighbor a jar of your wild grape jam in the autumn, and the following spring that neighbor might appear at your door with a dozen eggs from her hens, or an offer to help turn over the soil in your garden plot. There was no explicit agreement, no discussion of value or equivalence. It was simply understood that the gift would be reciprocated in some way, at some point, when the opportunity arose. This system required a certain patience, a willingness to let the accounts balance themselves over the long, slow arc of the seasons. Your own mental ledger was filled with such entries. There was the matter of the 2 pounds of white flour you had loaned to the widow Henderson 3 weeks ago, when she had run out unexpectedly and needed to make a batch of biscuits for her grandchildren's visit. You had not yet received anything in return, but you knew with certainty that at some point in the future a small gift would appear on your back steps, perhaps a few carrots from her garden or a jar of her excellent bread and butter pickles. There was the time you had spent an afternoon helping old Mr. Thurn Gorski repair a section of his fence that had blown down in a windstorm, and in return he had sharpened your kitchen knives on his whetstone until they could slice through a ripe tomato as if it was soft butter. There was the mending you had done for the young couple down the street, who had a new baby and no time for such tasks, and they have repaid you with a small sack of apples from the old tree in their backyard. Apples that were small and spotted, but wonderfully tart and crisp. These exchanges were the true currency of the town now, a quiet, steady flow of small kindnesses and practical help that kept the community functioning in the absence of the paper money that had once lubricated every transaction. The coins that remained in your possession were kept in a place separate from the empty wallet, a small private reserve that was not to be touched except in the most dire of circumstances. The wallet itself was a worn brown leather bifold that had been a gift many birthdays ago, its edges frayed and its surface cracked from years of being carried in a back pocket. It contained no money, only a few items of sentimental or practical value, a faded photograph, a library card from a library that had since closed its doors, a small piece of paper with a list of telephone numbers written in pencil, numbers for people who no longer had telephones. The wallet was carried out of habit, a vestigial object from another way of life. But the coins were kept elsewhere. The coins lived in a clean white handkerchief that was folded into a small, neat square and tucked into the back of a drawer in the bedroom dresser, beneath a stack of carefully ironed pillowcases. The handkerchief itself was made of fine, soft linen, one of a set that had been part of a hope chest assembled long ago and never fully used. The coins inside were a small, eclectic collection. There were a few copper pennies, their surfaces darkened to a deep chocolate brown, bearing the profile of a president with a beard. There was a single nickel, its silver-grey surface worn almost smooth, the image of the buffalo on the reverse so faint that it was barely discernible as anything more than a lumpy shape. There were 3 dimes, thin and light, their ridged edges still sharp enough to feel under a thumbnail, and there was 1 quarter, a heavy, substantial coin that felt important in the hand, its eagle reverse crisp and clear. The total sum was less than $1, perhaps 60 or 70 cents, but it was not the amount that mattered. It was the existence of the coins themselves, their tangible weight and metallic coolness that provided a small, quiet reassurance. They were a tiny hedge against the complete evaporation of the monetary world, a small, secret stash that could, in an absolute emergency, be exchanged for a loaf of bread or a box of matches. The coins were counted occasionally, not because the number ever changed, but because the act of counting them, of feeling each one between the thumb and forefinger, was a small, private ritual that affirmed the existence of value in a world that seemed to have forgotten what value meant. The rest of the walk home continued in the same calm, unhurried rhythm. You passed the house with the trumpet vine that grew over the front porch, its orange flowers long since faded to brown, papery husks that rattled softly in the breeze. You passed the vacant lot where the Carlson family had kept a large vegetable garden, the plot now overgrown with weeds, but still bearing a few volunteer tomato plants that had reseeded themselves from last year's fallen fruit. Their leaves a dusty green, and their small hard fruits blushing faintly with red. You passed the corner where the ice wagon used to stop every Tuesday and Thursday, the spot marked by a permanent damp stain on the pavement that had long since dried to a faint, ghostly outline. And finally, you turned onto your own street, the familiar row of houses coming into view, each one a small, quiet fortress against the larger quiet of the world. Your own house looked much as it had when you left it, a simple rectangular form with a steeply pitched roof and a small front porch shaded by a single large maple tree. The paint was the color of pale butter, faded and chalky, and the shutters beside the windows were a dark green that had weathered to a soft, silvery patina. The front steps creaked under your weight, a familiar sound that was as much a greeting as any spoken word. The door opened with a turn of the heavy, old-fashioned key, and you stepped inside, closing it behind you and shutting out the vast, empty silence of the street. Inside, the house was still, but it was a different kind of stillness, a stillness that was inhabited and warm, filled with the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel and the faint, distant smell of the soup pot from the day before. You stood for a moment in the front hall, letting your eyes adjust to the dimmer light, and you felt the quiet settle around you like a familiar, comfortable garment. The bank downtown was a quiet door now, its brass handles unturned and its vault standing empty. But in this house the ledgers were kept in a different way, and the accounts, such as they were, would be balanced by the small, steady exchanges of a life lived close to the ground, close to the neighbors, close to the simple, enduring things that held their value, regardless of what the banks might say. The weekly ritual of the laundry was a task that occupied the better part of a full day, a slow and methodical sequence of actions that had been performed in much the same way by generations of women in this house and in houses like it, stretching back to a time before the conveniences of electricity and indoor plumbing were even imagined. The work was heavy, repetitive, and required a certain physical endurance, but it was also, in its own way, a form of quiet meditation, a daily engagement with the fundamental elements of water, soap, air, and sunlight. There was a satisfaction to be found in the transformation of a basket of soiled, limp fabric into a line of clean, stiff garments snapping in the breeze, a small, tangible accomplishment in a world where accomplishments of any kind had become rare and hard to measure. The day began early, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, when the light in the kitchen was still grey and tentative. The first and most laborious step was the procurement of the water. The house was connected to the town's water main, a cast-iron pipe that ran beneath the street and delivered a sporadic, low-pressure flow of cold water to the single faucet at the kitchen sink. But the water from the tap was metered, and every gallon that passed through the little brass device in the basement added a few pennies to a bill that was already difficult to pay. So, for the heavy water demands of the laundry, the preferred source was the old hand pump that stood on a wooden platform over the shallow well just outside the back door. The pump was a tall, slender cylinder of cast iron painted a flaking shade of dark green, its handle a long, curved lever that required a firm, two-handed grip to operate. The act of pumping water was a full-body motion. You would grasp the handle and push it down with a smooth, steady pressure, then allow it to rise back up on its own, the internal leathers making a soft, wet, sucking sound as they drew the water up from the darkness below. Each stroke of the handle produced a gush of water that splashed into the waiting galvanized bucket, the sound of bright, cold splash that was the first distinct noise of the laundry day. The water from the well was always cold, even in the height of summer, and it had a particular taste and smell that was different from the chlorinated, slightly flat water from the tap. It smelled of clean, deep earth and a faint trace of iron, a mineral tang that was not unpleasant. You would fill 2 large buckets, their wire bales cutting into your palms as you carried them across the uneven flagstones of the back walk and into the kitchen, where they were set down heavily on the floor beside the stove. 2 more buckets would follow, and then perhaps 2 more, depending on the size of the load, until the large copper wash boiler that sat on the stove was filled to the appropriate level. The boiler was a substantial vessel, oval in shape and made of heavy gauge copper that had darkened over the years to a deep, ruddy brown streaked with the verdigris green of oxidation in the seams and around the handles. It held many gallons of water, and when it was full, it was far too heavy to lift, so the water had to be added bucket by bucket, a process that was slow and deliberate and provided ample time for the mind to wander or to simply rest in the rhythm of the task. While the water in the boiler began its slow journey toward a simmer, heated by the same banked coals that had kept the kitchen warm through the night, you would turn your attention to the other necessary equipment. The washing machine, if it could be called that, was a simple device of wood and metal that stood in the corner of the kitchen near the back door. It consisted of a round wooden tub, its staves held together by galvanized steel bands mounted on 3 splayed legs that gave it a slightly tipsy appearance. Inside the tub was a conical agitator made of ridged copper, connected by a series of gears and shafts to a long wooden handle that protruded from the side. To operate the machine, you would grasp this handle and push it back and forth, a motion that caused the agitator to rotate first one way and then the other, swirling the water and close together in a slow, sudsy vortex. The machine made a distinctive sound as it worked, a rhythmic, mechanical swish and plunk that was the heartbeat of the laundry day. Beside the washing machine stood the wringer, a separate device consisting of 2 heavy rubber rollers mounted in a cast iron frame, with a crank handle on one side and a tension adjustment screw on the top. The wringer was designed to squeeze the water out of the wet clothes, a task that required a certain attentiveness to avoid catching a finger or a button between the relentless rollers. The soap was the next item to be prepared. It was not the mild, fragrant factory-made soap that came in wrapped bars from the grocery store. It was a homemade product, a hard, brown, unappealing cake of lye soap that had been made the previous autumn in a large iron kettle over an open fire in the backyard, a process that was itself a full day's work and a source of considerable pride. The soap was stored in a wooden box lined with waxed paper, and it had a sharp, clean, slightly caustic smell that cleared the sinuses and made the eyes water if you leaned in too close. To use it for the laundry, you would take a bar and shave off thin curls with a knife, letting the shavings fall into a small enameled pan. These shavings would be dissolved in a pitcher of hot water from the kettle on the back of the stove, creating a cloudy, slightly slimy solution that would be added to the wash water in the wooden tub. The soap did not produce a great profusion of bubbles like the modern detergents advertised in the magazines. It produced a thin, greyish lather that smelled clean and astringent and worked its way into the fibers of the fabric with a quiet, persistent efficiency. The clothes themselves had been sorted the night before, separated into piles according to their colour and degree of soiling. There was a pile of white and light-coloured items, the sheets and pillowcases, the undergarments, a few of the older, more faded work shirts that could withstand the harshest treatment. There was a pile of darker, more durable items, the heavy denim trousers, the wool socks, the dark cotton dresses. And there was a small separate pile of particularly delicate items, things that would be washed by hand in a basin of cool water and set aside to dry flat, away from the punishing action of the agitator and the wringer. The first load to be washed was always the whites, which required the hottest water and the most soap. You would lift the copper boiler from the stove using heavy pot holders and carefully pour the steaming water into the wooden tub, the hot liquid splashing against the dry wood and releasing a cloud of fragrant steam that smelled of copper and clean heat. The soap solution was added, and then the first armload of white clothes was lowered into the water, the dry fabric drinking in the moisture and slowly sinking beneath the surface. The washing began. You would grasp the wooden handle and begin to push it back and forth, establishing a steady, unhurried rhythm. The agitator inside the tub churned the water, and the clothes swirled and tumbled, rubbing against each other and against the ridged copper cone. The sound was a soft, repetitive swishing, punctuated by the occasional heavier thump as a tangled mass of fabric hit the side of the tub. The work was physical, but not strenuous. A gentle, full-body motion that could be sustained for a long time without fatigue. As you worked the handle, your eyes might drift to the window above the sink, watching the light change over the backyard. The morning was advancing, the grey light giving way to a paler, brighter illumination, and the shapes of the sumac bushes and the bare branches of the apple tree were becoming more distinct against the sky. A small flock of sparrows flitted from the apple tree to the roof of the shed and back again, their movements quick and jerky, their tiny chirps barely audible through the glass. After a period of time that was measured not by a clock, but by the feel of the water and the look of the clothes, you would stop the agitation and let the tub rest. The clothes would drift to a stop, suspended in the cloudy, greyish water, and you would reach in and pull out a single item to inspect it. A pillowcase was lifted, dripping, from the tub, and you would hold it up to the light, examining the fabric for any remaining stains or soil. The white cotton was clean, its surface free of the faint grey tinge that had been there before, and the smell of the lye soap clung to it, sharp and clean. Satisfied, you would move to the wringer. The wet pillowcase was fed carefully between the two rubber rollers, and you would begin to turn the crank with your right hand while guiding the fabric with your left. The rollers gripped the cloth and pulled it through, squeezing out a stream of dirty water that cascaded back into the tub with a soft, splattering sound. The pillowcase emerged on the other side flattened and stiff, its moisture content reduced to a damp, heavy coolness rather than a dripping wetness. It was dropped into a waiting basket lined with a clean, dry towel, and the process was repeated with each item from the tub, one by one, the crank turning, the rollers squeezing, the pile of damp, clean clothes growing slowly in the basket. The washwater, now grey and cool, was bailed out of the tub and carried bucket by bucket out to the garden, where it was poured onto the roots of the tomato plants, a small, nutrient-rich offering that would not be wasted. The tub was rinsed with a bucket of clean cold water from the well, and then it was filled again with fresh hot water from the boiler for the first rinse. The clothes were returned to the tub, and the agitation began again, this time without soap, the clean water working to flush out the last remnants of the lye. The rinse water was then drained and replaced with a second rinse, this one containing a small splash of liquid bluing from a glass bottle with a cork stopper, a mysterious, deep blue liquid that was added in tiny amounts to counteract the natural yellowing of white cotton and make it appear brighter and whiter. The bluing swirled through the water in delicate, inky tendrils before dispersing into a uniform, pale azure that seemed impossibly clean and pure. A final pass through the wringer, and the first load was ready for the line. The clothesline was a simple arrangement of two tall wooden poles set into the ground at the far end of the backyard, with three parallel strands of heavy gauge galvanized wire strung between them. The wire had a dull, silvery sheen, and it sang a low humming note when the wind blew across it, a sound that was one of the characteristic noises of the backyard. The line was reached by walking across the uneven grass, a path that took you past the small, struggling vegetable plot, past the compost pile that was a dark, rich mound of coffee grounds and potato peelings and wilted lettuce leaves, past the old, unused doghouse that had been home to a series of long-gone pets and was now a shelter for a family of field mice. The grass was damp with the morning dew that had not yet burned off, and the hem of your dress would grow dark and heavy with moisture as you walked. The basket of damp clothes was set down on the grass beneath the line, and you would begin the slow, methodical work of hanging each item to dry. The clothespins were kept in a small cloth bag that hung from the line itself, a faded cotton sack that had once held 5 pounds of sugar and was now the permanent home of the wooden pins. The pins were simple, unvarnished pieces of birch or maple, split down the middle and held together with a small wire spring, their surfaces worn smooth and silvery grey from years of exposure to sun and rain. You would take a pin from the bag and hold it in your mouth, the dry, woody taste of it familiar and not unpleasant, while you shook out a damp sheet and draped it over the line. The sheet was heavy and unwieldy, and hanging it was a small negotiation with the wind, which liked to catch the fabric and billow it out like a sail, threatening to pull it from your grasp. But you would hold firm, anchoring one corner with a pin, then moving along the line to secure the other corner, smoothing the fabric flat and straight, so that it would dry without wrinkles. The pins made a soft wooden clacking sound as they were pressed onto the wire, gripping the fabric and the metal with a firm, secure hold. One by one, the items were lifted from the basket and hung on the line. The sheets were first, their large white rectangles filling the center strand and flapping gently in the breeze, releasing a clean, cold smell of soap and bluing. The pillowcases came next, hung by their closed ends so that they opened like white cotton windsocks, their embroidered edges fluttering. The shirts were hung by their shoulders, their sleeves dangling limply, their damp collars beginning to stiffen in the air. The undergarments were hung with a certain discreet care, tucked behind the larger items so that they were not the first thing a neighbor might see from the adjoining yard. The socks were pinned in pairs, their toes dangling down, their heels stretched into shape. As the line filled, it became a living, moving tapestry of white and pale colors, the fabric lifting and falling with the breeze, the shadows of the clothes shifting on the grass below. The work continued through the morning, the same sequence repeated with the darker clothes. Then, with the heavier items, the water in the boiler replenished, the tub drained and refilled, the wringer crank turning, the basket filling and emptying. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew warmer, and the smell of the laundry began to spread through the backyard. A clean, damp, soapy fragrance that mixed with the earthy scent of the garden and the sweet, dusty smell of the drying grass. By midday, the line was full. 3 sagging strands of wet clothes that dripped slowly onto the ground, creating a line of small, dark pockmarks in the dust. You would stand back and survey the work, a quiet sense of completion settling over you. The clothes would hang there for the rest of the afternoon, turning slowly in the breeze, drying under the pale, watchful eye of the sun. The hours that followed were a time of rest and waiting, the house quiet except for the soft, intermittent sounds from the backyard, the flap of a sheet, the creak of the wire line, the distant cry of a crow. You might sit in the chair by the front window, the mending basket at your feet, and listen to these sounds, letting them wash over you in slow, rhythmic waves. The laundry was doing its own work now, the sun and the wind taking over the task of finishing what your hands had begun. There was nothing more to be done but to wait, to let the day unfold at its own unhurried pace. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the light took on the warm golden quality of late day, you would return to the backyard to check the clothes. The sheets, which had been heavy and damp in the morning, were now light and crisp, their surfaces warm to the touch from the sun. The shirts were dry, their collars and cuffs stiff and slightly wrinkled, smelling intensely of the sun and the clean outdoor air. The socks were dry and soft, their woolen fibers relaxed and fluffy. One by one, the items were unpinned from the line, The wooden clothespins dropped back into the cloth bag with a soft clatter. The dry clothes were folded loosely and placed back into the basket, which was now lighter than it had been in the morning, the water weight having evaporated into the afternoon air. The feel of the sun-dried fabric in your hands was a particular pleasure, a crisp, rough texture that was entirely different from the soft, limp feel of clothes dried indoors or by a machine. The towels were almost abrasive, their cotton loops standing up stiffly, and they would scratch pleasantly against the skin after a bath. The sheets were smooth and cool, and they would carry the smell of the outdoors into the bedroom, a fragrance that promised deep, restful sleep. The basket was carried back into the house, and the clothes were sorted into piles for ironing, for folding, for putting away. Some items, the sheets and towels, required no further attention, and were simply folded into neat, flat squares and placed on the shelves of the linen closet in the hall. Others, the shirts and dresses, would need to be ironed, a task for another day, another quiet hour. But for now, the laundry was done. The copper boiler was empty and cool, the wooden tub was drained and wiped dry, the wringer was covered with its oilcloth shroud. The kitchen was quiet, the only remaining evidence of the day's labor. The lingering smell of lye soap and the faint, clean scent of sun-dried cotton that seemed to have permeated the very air of the house. You would stand for a moment at the back door, looking out at the empty clothesline, its 3 silver wires gleaming dully in the fading light. The weight of the day was gone, lifted like the water from the clothes, and in its place was a quiet, simple satisfaction, the knowledge that the work had been done, and done well, and that tomorrow the clothes on your back and the sheets on your bed would carry with them the memory of the sun and the wind, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own 2 hands. The evening arrived without ceremony, as it always did, a gradual dimming of the light that seeped through the west-facing windows and a corresponding deepening of the shadows in the corners of the rooms. The sun, which had been a pale, watery disk behind the perpetual overcast for most of the afternoon, slipped below the horizon somewhere beyond the empty fields and the distant line of bare trees, and the world outside the house was transformed from a landscape of muted greys and browns into a uniform, featureless darkness. There was no street lamp at the corner to cast a pool of yellow light onto the pavement, no glow from neighboring windows to suggest the presence of other lives being lived nearby. The darkness was complete and unbroken, a soft, velvety blackness that pressed against the window panes like a held breath, and the house became a small, isolated island of light and warmth in the midst of it. The light inside the house came from a single source, a floor lamp that stood in the corner of the front room next to the armchair. The lamp was an old one, its base made of heavy, tarnished brass that had been molded into the shape of a fluted column, and its shade was of amber-colored glass, painted on the inside with a faded design of scrolling vines and flowers that were barely visible, except when the lamp was lit. The bulb inside was of the lowest wattage that could be purchased at the hardware store before it had reduced its hours, a small, pear-shaped globe of frosted glass that produced a soft, warm, orange-tinted glow. The light did not fill the room so much as it gathered in a small, intimate circle around the chair, leaving the rest of the space in a state of gentle, shadowy obscurity. The edges of the room, the bookcase against the far wall and the dark shape of the piano that no one played anymore, were only faintly suggested, their forms dissolving into the darkness like objects seen through deep water. On other evenings, when the supply of electricity was uncertain, or when the monthly bill had to be stretched as far as possible, the light came instead from a kerosene lamp that sat on the small round table beside the chair. The lamp was a simple, functional object, its base a clear glass reservoir that held the pale, amber-colored fuel, its burner a brass mechanism with a small toothed wheel that raised and lowered the wick. The chimney was a slender tube of clear glass that had developed a faint, smoky haze on the inside from countless hours of use, and it was topped with a small, flared shade of white glass that directed the light downward onto the pages of a book or the work in a pair of hands. To light the lamp was a small, careful ritual. You would remove the chimney and set it aside, turn the small wheel to raise the wick a fraction of an inch, and then touch a match to the exposed fiber. The wick would catch with a soft, liquid pop, and a small yellow flame would appear, wavering and uncertain at first, then steadying into a bright teardrop shape. The chimney was replaced, and the flame settled behind the glass, its light softening and spreading, filling the immediate area with a warm, golden glow that was somehow more intimate and more alive than the steady, impersonal light of the electric bulb. The lamp made a soft, continuous sound as it burned, a faint, whispering hiss that was the sound of the kerosene being drawn up through the wick and converted into light and a barely perceptible warmth. The smell of the lamp was a part of the evening as well, a faint, oily scent that was not unpleasant and that mingled with the other smells of the room, the dust of old books, the faint residue of the evening meal, the clean, dry smell of the braided rug on the floor. The book that rested on the table beside the lamp was not a novel or a collection of stories. It was a copy of the Farmer's Almanac, a thin, paper-bound volume with a cover of pale yellow-orange that had been handled so many times that the corners were soft and rounded and the spine was creased and cracked. The cover bore the year, a date that had once seemed impossibly far in the future and was now nearly half gone, and it featured a woodcut illustration of a farmer in a broad-brimmed hat walking behind a plough, the image printed in a simple, rustic style. The almanac had been purchased at the general store the previous autumn for the price of a dime, and it had been read and consulted so frequently in the months since that it had become a familiar, comforting presence, its pages holding a wealth of information that was both practical and, in its own peculiar way, soothing to the mind. The almanac was filled with charts and tables and columns of small, dense type. There were pages devoted to the phases of the moon, showing the precise dates and times of the new moon and the full moon and the quarters in between. The information presented in a series of small, circular diagrams that looked like the phases of the moon themselves, pale circles against the dark background of the printed page. There were pages of weather forecasts for the entire year, predictions of temperature and precipitation that had been calculated according to a secret formula known only to the almanac's original founder and passed down through the generations. These forecasts were not always accurate, but they were read with a certain grave attention, as if the very act of reading them could influence the weather to come. There were pages of astronomical data listing the rising and setting times of the sun and the planets, information that had little practical use in a town where the sun rose and set over the same familiar fields every day, but that was nonetheless recorded and consulted with a quiet, patient interest. The section that received the most attention on these long, quiet evenings was the section devoted to planting and gardening. The almanac contained detailed tables that specified the best days for planting different crops according to the phase of the moon and the sign of the zodiac. There were days that were favorable for planting root crops when the moon was in a certain phase and the gravitational pull of the celestial bodies was said to draw the plant's energy down into the soil, and there were days that were favorable for planting above-ground crops when the moon's influence was said to encourage leafy growth and abundant fruit. These recommendations were read slowly and carefully, the small type followed with a finger that traced the lines across the page, the information absorbed and filed away in the mind for the coming spring. Even though the actual planting was months away and the ground outside was hard and cold, the act of reading about the best day to set out tomato seedlings or to sow a row of lettuce was a small act of hope, a quiet affirmation that the cycle of the seasons would continue and that there would be a garden again, a plot of turned earth and green sprouts, and the slow, patient work of tending and harvesting. You would sit in the armchair, the lamp casting its warm circle of light over your shoulder and onto the open pages of the almanac. The chair was old and comfortable, its upholstery worn to a soft, velvety smoothness in the places where arms and back had rested against it for decades. A small, faded cushion was tucked behind your lower back, and a woolen afghan, knitted from scraps of leftover yarn in a pattern of alternating dark and light squares, was draped over your lap, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that seeped in around the window frames and under the door. The cat, if it was in the mood for company, would be curled in a tight ball on the braided rug at your feet, its orange fur glowing warmly in the lamplight, its sides rising and falling in the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep. The only sounds in the room were the soft hiss of the lamp, the whisper of a page being turned, and the distant, intermittent creak of the house, settling as the temperature outside continued to drop. The act of reading was a slow, deliberate process. The light from the lamp was just bright enough to illuminate the page, but it required a certain concentration, a certain leaning in toward the book, to make out the small, dense type. You would hold the almanac in both hands, its weight light and familiar, and your eyes would move across the lines of text, pausing occasionally to consider a particular piece of information, or to let the mind wander down the quiet paths of association that the word suggested. A table of frost dates for the region listed the average date of the last spring frost and the first fall frost, and these dates would be noted and compared to the memory of past seasons, to the year when the frost had come late and spared the tomatoes until nearly November, or the year when an early freeze had blackened the bean vines overnight and left the garden looking like a field of brown, withered ghosts. The almanac did not judge or comment on these memories. It simply presented its data in neat, orderly columns, a small fixed point of reference in a world that had become unmoored from many of its former certainties. Beyond the circle of lamplight, the rest of the room existed in a state of soft, shadowy suggestion. The bookcase against the far wall was a dark, rectangular shape, its shelves filled with the dim outlines of other books, volumes that had been in the family for years, and that were rarely opened anymore. There was a set of encyclopedias, their leather spines cracked and faded, their gilt lettering almost entirely worn away. There was a collection of novels by authors whose names were once famous but were now fading from memory, their pages yellowed and brittle. There was a family Bible, a large, heavy volume with a cover of embossed black leather and pages edged in gold that had dulled to a soft, brassy sheen. The Bible was not read often, but its presence on the shelf was a quiet comfort, a link to a longer, slower rhythm of time that stretched back through generations and forward into a future that was, for now, unknowable. The sound of a page turning was a small, distinctive noise in the quiet room. The paper of the almanac was thin and cheap, and it made a soft, rustling sound as it was lifted and turned, a sound that was like the whisper of dry leaves or the distant rustle of a mouse in the wall. The new page would settle into place, and the light from the lamp would fall on a fresh column of type, a new table of data, a new set of small, precise facts about the world and its workings. The reading would continue, the eyes moving slowly across the page, the mind absorbing the information with a calm, unhurried attention. There was no need to rush, no need to finish the chapter or reach a particular point in the text. The almanac was not a book to be read from cover to cover. It was a book to be dipped into, to be consulted and pondered, to be read in small, quiet increments that stretched across the weeks and months. Occasionally, you would look up from the page and let your gaze rest on the window. The glass was a dark rectangle that reflected the lamp's flame back into the room, a small, wavering ghost of light that seemed to float in the darkness beyond the pane. Outside, there was nothing to be seen, only the deep, velvety blackness of the night and, if the sky was clear, the faint cold glitter of a few distant stars. The stars were small and hard and seemed very far away, their light traveling across immense empty distances to reach this small, warm room. The almanac had pages devoted to the stars as well, charts that showed the positions of the constellations and the parts of the planets, and you might turn to these pages and try to match the printed diagrams with the scattered points of light visible through the window. The constellations had names that were old and strange, names from ancient myths and legends, and saying them silently to yourself was like reciting a small private poem. Cassiopeia, Orion, the Pleiades. The stars did not care about the price of wheat or the balance in a closed bank account. They moved in their slow, predictable courses, following laws that were ancient and immutable, and watching them or reading about them in the small type of the almanac was a reminder that the world was larger and older and more patient than the small immediate concerns of a single life in a single town. The hour grew later, and the quality of the silence in the house deepened. The cat, if it was present, would stir occasionally, lifting its head and blinking slowly in the lamplight, before tucking its nose back under its tail and resuming its sleep. The flame in the lamp would burn steadily, its small yellow tongue of fire consuming the kerosene at a slow, measured rate, the level of the fuel in the glass reservoir dropping almost imperceptibly over the course of the evening. When the flame began to flicker and dim, a sign that the wick needed trimming or the fuel was running low, you would set the almanac aside and attend to the lamp with the same slow, careful attention that you brought to all the evening's small rituals. The chimney was removed, the wick was raised slightly, and the charred, blackened tip was trimmed away with a small pair of scissors kept on the table for this purpose. the ash falling into a small dish. The wick was then lowered, the chimney replaced, and the flame would steady and brighten, its light renewed and ready for another stretch of quiet reading. The almanac would be picked up again, its familiar weight settling into your hands. The pages that received the most attention in the late hours were often the pages at the very back, the section of miscellaneous information and curious facts. There were recipes for home remedies, concoctions of herbs and common household ingredients said to cure everything from a cough to a case of the rheumatism. There were brief, practical essays on topics such as the care of poultry or the proper method for sharpening an axe. There were tables of weights and measures, listing the number of teaspoons in a tablespoon and the number of pecks in a bushel. Information that was so basic and so fundamental that it had a certain comforting solidity. A reminder that the world was built on small, knowable units. And there were the famous weather predictions, the long-range forecasts that stretched out for months into the future, describing the expected conditions for each week of the coming year in a few brief cryptic phrases: fair and mild, unsettled with showers, cold wave likely. These phrases were read and considered, compared to the actual weather outside the window, and filed away in the mind as a small, quiet prediction of what was to come. Eventually, the hour would arrive when the eyes grew heavy and the words on the page began to blur and lose their meaning. The almanac would be closed, its soft, worn cover pressed shut, and it would be returned to its place on the small round table, ready for the next evening, the next quiet hour. The lamp would be extinguished with a small, careful breath, directed at the top of the chimney, the flame disappearing with a soft, final puff, leaving behind the faint, warm smell of kerosene and a thin, curling wisp of smoke. The room would be plunged into a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the faint grey rectangle of the window, and you would sit for a moment in the quiet, letting your eyes adjust to the absence of light. The sounds of the house would seem to grow louder in the darkness, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the creak of a floorboard, the soft, distant sigh of the wind moving through the bare branches of the maple tree outside. These sounds were not alarming or unsettling. They were the familiar, companionable noises of a house at rest, a house that was settling into its own form of sleep. You would rise from the chair, the woolen afghan falling away, and make your way slowly through the dark, familiar rooms toward the stairs. The route was known by heart. The number of steps from the chair to the doorway, the location of the slight rise in the floorboards near the hall closet, the position of the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. Your hand would find the smooth, worn wood of the banister, and you would begin the slow, careful climb to the second floor, each step a small, measured movement in the darkness. The bedroom was cold, the air sharp and still, but the bed was waiting, its layers of quilt and wool blanket turned down and ready. You would slip between the cold sheets, the fabric smooth and crisp from the line, and you would lie there in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the night and waiting for sleep to come. The almanac remained downstairs on its table, its pages filled with the promise of planting days and weather patterns, and the slow, steady turning of the seasons. A small, steady turning of the seasons, a small, paper-bound testament to the continuity of the world, a quiet companion in the long, dark hours of the evening. The decision to take a walk was not a decision in the usual sense of the word, not a choice between alternatives or a plan that required preparation. It was more of a gradual inclination, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the body's relationship to the stillness of the house, a feeling that the legs would welcome a stretch and the eyes would welcome a change of scene, even if the scene was the same one they had looked upon 100 times before. The morning had passed in its usual quiet way, the breakfast dishes washed and dried and put back on their shelves, the kitchen floor swept with the worn broom that left fine, parallel scratches in the linoleum, the mending basket attended to for a short while, until the light at the window grew too bright and glaring for the fine work. Now the sun was high, though still pale behind the thin, high overcast that seemed to be a permanent feature of the sky in this season, and the temperature had risen just enough to make a light wrap sufficient. You would find yourself standing by the back door, your hand resting on the smooth, worn knob, and without any particular thought, you would open the door and step outside. The air in the backyard was still and carried the faint, dry scent of the brown grass and the dusty earth of the garden plot. The clothesline was empty. its 3 silver wires gleaming dully in the pale light and humming a low, almost inaudible note in the breeze that was barely strong enough to stir the dry leaves of the sumac bushes at the edge of the property. You would walk across the uneven grass, your feet following a path that was more a suggestion than a trail, a faint depression in the ground that led past the corner of the shed and toward a gap in the straggly hedge of lilacs that separated your yard from the empty field beyond. The lilacs had finished blooming weeks ago, and their leaves were now a tired, dusty green, curled slightly at the edges from the lack of rain. Pushing through the gap, you would emerge onto a narrow, unofficial footpath that ran along the back edge of the neighboring properties. A strip of packed earth that had been worn smooth by the feet of children taking shortcuts to school and men walking to jobs that no longer existed. The path was wide enough for one person to walk comfortably, and it was bordered on one side by the untended margins of the backyards, with their woodpiles and compost heaps and struggling vegetable patches, and on the other side by a shallow, grassy ditch that separated the path from the beginning of the open fields. The feel of the ground underfoot was the first and most immediate sensation of the walk. You were wearing your everyday shoes, a pair of brown leather Oxfords that had been resoled once already and were showing signs of needing the service again. The leather was soft and pliable, molded to the shape of your feet, and the soles were thin enough that you could feel the texture of the path through them, the small, hard pebbles and the finer, powdery dust, and the occasional protruding root of a tree that had been worn smooth and shiny by countless passing feet. The ground was dry, and each step raised a small, soft puff of dust that settled on the leather of the shoes and the hem of your dress, a fine, pale film that would need to be brushed off before you re-entered the house. The rhythm of walking was a slow, steady beat, a soft scuff and crunch that was the only sound you made, and it was a sound that seemed to belong naturally to the quiet of the afternoon, blending with the rustle of the dry grass in the ditch and the distant, intermittent call of a bird somewhere out in the fields. The ditch was a small, neglected ecosystem, a narrow strip of land that was too wet in the spring and too dry in the summer to be of any agricultural use. It had been left to its own devices for years, and it had developed a wild, tangled beauty of its own. The dominant plant was a thick stand of milkweed, its tall, straight stalks rising from a mat of narrower grasses and weeds. The milkweed pods were the most striking feature of the ditch at this time of year. They were large and teardrop-shaped, covered with soft, pale green bumps, and many of them had split open along a single seam, revealing the tight-packed mass of silky white floss within. The floss was so fine and light that it seemed to shimmer and move even when there was no perceptible breeze, and occasionally a single tiny filament would break free and drift lazily up into the air, catching the pale sunlight and floating away across the field like a small earthbound cloud. You would pause for a moment to look at a particularly full pod, reaching out to touch the soft, dry floss with the tip of a finger. The texture was impossibly fine, like the breath of a ghost, and it clung to your skin with a faint, tickling static. A few of the pods had already released most of their seeds, and the empty, leathery husks hung on the stalks like small brown canoes, their interiors dark and hollow. Beyond the milkweed, closer to the ground, there were other plants. There was Queen Anne's lace, its flat, white, lacy flower heads now dried and curled inward to form small brown bird nest shapes. There were clumps of goldenrod just beginning to show their yellow plumes, the color a bright, cheerful note against the prevailing browns and grays. There was a tangle of wild morning glory vines, their heart-shaped leaves dusty and limp, their small, white, trumpet-shaped flowers closed tightly against the pale daylight. And there were the ever-present dandelions, their yellow blooms long since turned to puffballs of white seed that scattered at the slightest touch, and their jagged, dark green leaves hugging the ground. You would walk slowly, your eyes scanning the ditch with a calm, unfocused attention, noting the different textures and colors, the way the light fell on the curved surface of a milkweed pod, and the way the shadow of a grass stem lay across a flat, grey stone. The world at this small scale was full of quiet, intricate detail, a slow, silent drama of growth and decay and patient waiting that had nothing to do with the larger, noisier concerns of the world beyond the fields. The path continued for perhaps a quarter of a mile, running parallel to the back fences of the houses on the next street over, He would pass the back of the Gorskis' property, where old Mr. Gorski's neat, compact garden was laid out in precise rectangular beds, the soil dark and finely textured, the stakes of the tomato plants standing in orderly rows like a small, silent army. Mr. Gorsky himself was not visible, but the evidence of his careful, methodical labor was everywhere, from the neatly coiled hose beside the spigot to the stack of weathered wooden flats waiting to be filled with seedlings in the spring. You would pass the back of the widow Henderson's house, where a flock of Rhode Island red hens scratched and pecked in a wire-enclosed run, their soft, throaty clucking a familiar, comforting sound. One of the hens, a particularly large and dignified specimen, would pause in her scratching and fix you with a bright, black, unblinking eye for a moment before returning to her search for grubs and seeds. The smell of the chicken run, a warm, dusty, faintly ammoniac scent, drifted across the path and mingled with the cleaner smells of the field and the ditch. After passing the last of the houses, the path veered away from the properties and angled out into the open field, becoming even fainter and less distinct. The ground here was rougher, covered with a sparse dry grass and dotted with the flat grey-green rosettes of mullein leaves. The field stretched away to the north and west, a vast, gently undulating expanse of brown and tan that seemed to go on forever, eventually meeting the pale, hazy sky at a line that was soft and indistinct. In the distance, you could see the dark vertical line of a fence row, a straggling growth of Osage orange and wild cherry trees that marked the boundary of the old Henderson pasture, and beyond that, the faint grey shape of a barn roof. The scale of the landscape was immense and quiet, and walking into it felt like walking into a larger, slower kind of time, a time measured by the growth of trees and the erosion of hills rather than by the ticking of a clock. The purpose of this particular walk, insofar as it had a purpose, was to check on a small garden plot that you had been allowed to use on a patch of fallow ground at the very edge of town, a piece of land that belonged to a farmer who lived a mile further down the road and who had no use for it himself. The arrangement was a simple one, an informal agreement made over a fence rail one afternoon the previous spring. You could plant what you liked on the plot, and in return you would share a portion of the harvest with the farmer's family. There was no paper signed, no money exchanged, only a nod and the handshake, and the quiet understanding that the land would be cared for and respected. The plot was not large, perhaps 30 feet square, and it had been a struggle to break the sod and work the heavy clay soil into something that would support a crop. But you had done it, turning the earth with a borrowed spade and adding whatever organic matter you could scavenge, the compost from your own pile, the rotted manure from a neighbor's barn, the ashes from the kitchen stove. The garden had produced a modest but satisfying harvest of beans and tomatoes and squash the previous summer, and now, in the off-season, it lay fallow, a rectangle of bare, brown earth that was waiting patiently for the spring. The walk to the plot took you along the edge of a narrow, unpaved lane that ran straight as an arrow for half a mile before curving gently around a low, grassy hill. The surface of the lane was packed dirt and gravel, and in the middle, where the wheels of wagons and the occasional automobile had worn a pair of shallow ruts, the ground was hard and smooth. You walked in one of these ruts, your feet finding the familiar even surface, your eyes watching the way the pale, dusty gravel sparkled faintly in the thin sunlight. The heat of the day, such as it was, had begun to create a faint shimmer in the air above the lane further ahead, a wavering, watery distortion that made the distant fence posts seem to dance and tremble. It was a phenomenon you had seen 1,000 times, and it never failed to hold your attention for a moment, this visible evidence of the air's warmth rising from the sun-baked earth. The fence posts themselves were a study in repetition and variation. They were made of split locust wood, a dense, heavy, rot-resistant timber that had weathered to a silvery grey. They stood at regular intervals along the edge of the lane, each one set deep in the ground and leaning at a slightly different angle, the result of decades of frost heave and the gentle, persistent pressure of the wire that was stapled to them. The wire was rusted to a dark reddish-brown, and it sagged between the posts in a series of long, shallow curves, its barbs worn and dulled by weather. You would pass post after post, each one a small, silent sentinel marking the boundary between the lane and the field, and as you walked, you could look ahead and see the line of posts receding into the distance, their silvery shapes growing smaller and closer together, until they converged at a vanishing point somewhere near the base of the distant hill. The geometry of the fence was a simple, satisfying thing, a straight line drawn across the uneven landscape, a human imposition of order on the wild, unruly growth of the field. The garden plot, when you reached it, was much as you had left it. It was a simple rectangle of bare soil, its edges marked by 4 corner stakes made of scrap lumber, and it lay quiet and still under the pale sky. A few dried cornstalks from the previous year's small patch of sweet corn still stood in one corner, their leaves brown and papery and rustling softly in the light breeze. The soil was cracked in places, a network of fine, shallow fissures that traced the pattern of the last rain's drying. You would walk slowly around the perimeter of the plot, your eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the seeds you had planted weeks ago, a late sowing of winter rye that was meant to protect the soil from erosion and add organic matter when it was turned under in the spring. The rye had sprouted, and a faint green haze was visible over the surface of the soil, a delicate, almost invisible fuzz of tiny pale green leaves that seemed too fragile to survive the coming cold. But they would survive, you knew. They were winter rye, bred for this very purpose, and they would lie dormant under the snow and resume their slow growth in the early spring. You would crouch down, your knees pressing into the cool, dry earth, and touch one of the tiny leaves with the tip of a finger. It was cool and smooth and surprisingly firm, a small, living promise in the midst of the dormant field. There was nothing to be done at the plot, no work that required attention. The weeding had been finished weeks ago, and the soil was too dry to need any cultivation. The visit was simply a visit, a quiet check-in, a way of maintaining a connection to this small piece of ground that you had worked and would work again. You would stand for a while at the edge of the plot, looking out across the field toward the distant line of trees that marked the course of the creek, a dark, meandering ribbon of bare branches and evergreens. The view was vast and empty and still, and standing there you felt a sense of peace that was different from the peace of the house. It was the peace of the open land, the peace of the sky and the wind, and the slow, patient turning of the seasons, a peace that was larger and older and more indifferent than the small, domestic peace of the kitchen and the front room. The return walk took you along a different route, a loop that passed by the home of a neighbor who lived on a small acreage just outside the official town limits. The neighbor was a woman named Mrs. Becker, a widow of many years who kept a large vegetable garden and a small flock of laying hens, and who was known for her generosity with both her produce and her quiet, undemanding company. Her house was a small, white farmhouse set back from the road, its paint peeling in places and its front porch sagging slightly, but its yard was tidy and its windows were clean, and the smell of wood smoke from her chimney was a welcoming scent on the cool afternoon air. You would walk up the gravel drive, your footsteps crunching softly on the loose stones, and you would see the curtain at the front window twitch slightly, a sign that your approach had been noted. There was no need to knock. Mrs. Note Decker appeared at the front door just as you reached the bottom step of the porch, wiping her hands on a faded apron that had once been a bright, cheerful print. She was a small, wiry woman with grey hair pulled back into a neat bun and eyes that were a pale, watery blue, and she smiled a quiet, tired smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. The conversation that followed was not a conversation in the usual sense of the word, not an exchange of news or opinions or plans. It was a slow, easy exchange of small observations and simple courtesies, the kind of talk that required no effort and left no residue of obligation. She would remark that the milkweed pods were opening early this year, and you would agree, noting the abundance of the silky floss in the ditch. She would ask if you had checked on your garden plot, and you would describe the faint green haze of the winter rye, and she would nod, a small, satisfied gesture, as if your report confirmed something she already knew. The true purpose of the visit, the unspoken purpose, was accomplished when you produced from the deep pocket of your coat a small paper packet. The packet was made of a folded square of brown paper, the kind that had once wrapped a pound of sugar, and it was tied with a piece of white cotton string. Inside were the seeds you had saved from the previous summer's zinnias, the bright, cheerful flowers that had bloomed in a riot of orange, pink, and red along the edge of your own small flower bed. You had dried the flower heads carefully in the sun, rubbing the dry petals away to reveal the small arrow-shaped seeds within, and you had saved them in a glass jar until there were enough to share. The packet was small and light, and it made a faint, dry, rustling sound when you placed it in Mrs. Becker's outstretched hand. She would look at the packet, turning it over in her thin, work-roughened fingers, and she would smile again, a wider, warmer smile this time. She would say something about the color of the zinnias, remembering the particular shade of deep velvety red that had bloomed by your back steps, and she would promise to plant them in the spring in the sunny spot by her own back door. The exchange was complete, a small, quiet transaction of seeds for a promise, a tiny thread of connection woven between two houses and two gardens and two lives that would otherwise have remained separate. In return, as you turned to leave, Mrs. Becker would press something into your hand. It was a jar, a small half-pint mason jar filled with a dark amber-colored liquid. Sorghum syrup, she would say, made from the cane her brother-in-law grew on his place 2 counties over, the last of the batch from the previous fall. The jar was heavy and cool, and the syrup inside was thick and slow-moving, catching the light and glowing like liquid bronze. You would thank her, the words simple and sincere, and you would tuck the jar carefully into your other coat pocket, feeling its solid weight against your hip. The walk home would be slightly different now, your gait adjusted to accommodate the precious, fragile cargo, and the weight of the jar was a small, tangible reminder of the network of quiet exchanges that sustained life in this quiet place. The return journey retraced the same lane, past the same fence posts, the same shimmer of heat on the gravel, the same ditch with its milkweed pods and its goldenrod. The light had shifted slightly, the sun having moved a perceptible distance across the pale sky, and the shadows of the fence posts now stretched out across the lane, long grey fingers of shade that pointed toward the east. The air was cooler now, the faint warmth of the midday having given way to the sharper, clearer chill of the approaching evening. You would walk at the same slow, steady pace, your feet finding the familiar ruts, your eyes watching the landscape pass in its slow, unchanging parade. The walk had no climax, no moment of revelation or drama. It was simply a walk, a slow, meandering loop through a quiet world, a journey undertaken for no urgent reason and completed with no particular fanfare. The only evidence that it had occurred at all was the small jar of sorghum syrup in your pocket, the memory of the milkweed floss drifting on the still air, and the faint, pleasant ache in the muscles of your legs, a quiet reminder that you had moved through the world, that you had been a part of its slow, patient unfolding for another afternoon. The front room, after the last of the evening light had drained from the sky, and the kerosene lamp had been extinguished with a soft, directed breath, became a place of profound and complete darkness. It was not the darkness of a moonless night in the open countryside, a darkness that was softened and textured by the faint, ambient glow of starlight and the pale luminosity of the horizon. It was the darkness of an enclosed space, a room with its curtains drawn and its single window facing away from any possible source of light, a darkness so deep and so uniform that it seemed to have a physical presence, a soft velvety weight that pressed gently against the eyes. In this darkness, the familiar shapes of the furniture, the armchair and the round table and the tall shadowy bulk of the bookcase, ceased to exist as visual objects and became instead presences that were known only by memory and by the faint, almost inaudible sounds they made as they settled into the cooling night air. The room was no longer a collection of things, but a single, unified volume of quiet, and at the center of that quiet, as constant and as reliable as a heartbeat, was the sound of the clock. The clock stood on the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace, a position of honor it had occupied for as long as anyone in the house could remember. The mantelpiece itself was a simple, unadorned shelf of dark wood, its surface marked by a few pale rings where a sweating glass had been set down carelessly in some long-ago summer, and its front edge was carved with a simple, repeating pattern of shallow curves. The fireplace below it was empty and clean, the iron grate holding a small pile of grey ashes that were the remains of the last fire of the previous winter, and the brass andirons, shaped like stylized lions, stood guard over the cold, dark cavity. The clock was the sole ornament on the mantel, flanked by nothing but the bare, dusty wood, and its presence there was so established, so utterly taken for granted, that it was rarely looked at directly. It was simply there, a part of the room's essential furniture, as permanent and as unremarkable as the floorboards or the ceiling. The clock itself was a mantel clock of a style that had been popular in the latter years of the previous century, a rectangular case made of dark walnut that had been polished and cared for over the decades until the wood had developed a deep, rich, almost black patina, broken only by the subtle waving grain that was visible when the light caught it at a certain angle. The case was simple and unadorned, its only decoration a pair of thin, parallel lines incised into the wood around the perimeter of the front panel, and a small, turned wooden finial, shaped like a flattened acorn, that sat atop the peaked roof of the case. The front of the clock was a single sheet of glass, slightly convex and beveled at the edges, behind which the face of the clock was displayed. The face was made of white enamel on a thin copper plate, and it had yellowed very slightly with age, developing a warm, creamy tone that was most noticeable around the edges where the enamel was thinnest. The numerals were Roman, painted in a thin, black, serifed script that was elegant and slightly formal, and they marched around the perimeter of the dial in their familiar, stately order: I, 2, 3, IV, V, Z, 7, 8, 8, ein, X, even, thaft. The hands were made of thin, black metal, shaped into delicate, tapering spades, and they moved around the dial with a slow, deliberate grace that was almost imperceptible in any given moment, but that accumulated over the hours into a complete, silent revolution. The face of the clock also featured a smaller, secondary dial set into the lower half, a circle of the same creamy enamel with its own tiny, delicate hands. This was the calendar dial, and it displayed the day of the month in small black numerals that clicked forward with a soft, mechanical sound at midnight, a sound that was rarely heard by anyone who was already asleep. The calendar dial required manual adjustment at the end of every month that did not have 31 days, a small, careful ritual that involved opening the glass door and reaching in with a fingertip to turn the tiny, knurled knob that advanced the date. This task was performed on the first morning of each new month, a quiet, private observance of the passage of time that was both mundane and, in its own way, solemn. The lower portion of the clock face, below the calendar dial, was cut away to reveal a small, oval window through which the pendulum could be seen. The pendulum was a disc of polished brass about the size of a silver dollar, that hung from a thin, flat steel spring and swung back and forth in a slow, unwavering arc. The brass had been polished at one time, but the years of exposure to the air had dulled its surface to a soft, mellow gleam, and it now reflected only the faintest glimmer of whatever light happened to be in the room, a tiny, moving spark of gold that appeared and disappeared with each swing. The pendulum's motion was the visible manifestation of the clock's inner life, the steady, rhythmic pulse that drove the hands around the dial and produced the sound that filled the quiet room. The sound of the clock was not a single uniform noise, but a complex, layered composition of small, distinct auditory events that repeated themselves in an endless, predictable cycle. The most prominent element was the tick, a sharp, crisp sound that occurred once with each swing of the escapement wheel, a sound that was produced by the collision of a hardened steel tooth against a pallet stone of polished agate. The tick was clear and distinct, a small, precise note that cut through the silence of the room and then faded, leaving a tiny after-ring that was more felt than heard. The tick was followed, after a brief, measured interval, by the tock, a sound that was nearly identical to the tick but occurred on the opposite swing of the pendulum and was produced by the engagement of the other pallet stone. The two sounds, tick and tock, were subtly different in character, the result of minute asymmetries in the escapement mechanism, and a careful listener could distinguish between them. The tick was perhaps a fraction brighter, a tiny bit sharper, while the tock was a shade mellower, a tiny bit rounder. Together they formed a steady, two-beat rhythm that was the fundamental pulse of the room. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. Beneath the tick and the tock, there was another layer of sound, a continuous, low-pitched whirring that was the sound of the clock's gear train in motion. This sound was so faint that it was only audible in the deepest quiet of the night, when every other sound had faded away and the ear had grown accustomed to the silence. It was a soft, whispering sound, like the distant turning of a well-oiled wheel, and it rose and fell very slightly in pitch with each swing of the pendulum, a subtle modulation that added a kind of breathing quality to the clock's voice. And beneath even that, at the very threshold of perception, there was the faint metallic hum of the mainspring, a tightly coiled ribbon of tempered steel that was slowly, gradually unwinding, releasing the stored energy that drove the entire mechanism. This hum was not so much a sound as a presence, a low, steady vibration that could be felt through the wooden case if you placed your hand upon it, a small, constant tremor that was the clock's own quiet form of life. The sound of the clock filled the front room in a way that no other sound could. It was not a loud sound, not an intrusive sound, but it was a pervasive sound, a sound that seemed to occupy every corner of the space and to seep into the very walls and floorboards. The ticking and the toking, the soft whirring and the faint hum all combined to create a sonic environment that was both constant and ever-changing. A slow, steady river of sound that flowed through the darkness and carried the minutes and hours along with it. The clock did not mark time so much as it created time, spinning it out of the silent void with each precise mechanical click of the escapement, weaving the raw material of duration into the familiar, measurable units of seconds and minutes and hours. To sit in the dark room and listen to the clock was to be immersed in the very process of time's creation, to feel the slow, steady pulse of the passing night as a physical, auditory presence. The ticking of the clock was a sound that could be listened to actively, with a focused, attentive ear, or passively, as a kind of background music that played on the edges of awareness. When listened to actively, the tick and the tock became distinct. Individual events, each one a small, sharp note that hung in the air for a moment before being replaced by the next. You could count the ticks, letting the numbers accumulate in your mind, and you would find that the rhythm was so steady, so perfectly regular, that you could anticipate the exact moment of the next tick, could feel it coming in the tiny, expectant silence between the beats. The interval between tick and tock was slightly longer than the interval between tock and tick, a subtle asymmetry that was a result of the clock's design, and this slight, almost imperceptible variation gave the rhythm a kind of lilt, a gentle, swinging quality that was oddly soothing. When listened to passively, the ticking blended into a continuous, flowing sound, a soft, percussive texture that was like the sound of a distant, steady rain or the murmur of a slow-moving stream. The individual ticks lost their distinct edges and merged into a single, ongoing sonic wash, a calm, unhurried pulse that was the sound of time itself passing. The wooden case of the clock was not a silent partner in this nocturnal performance. The wood, being an organic material that responded to changes in temperature and humidity, had its own small, quiet voice. As the night deepened and the air in the room grew colder, the walnut case would contract ever so slightly, and this contraction produced a series of small, sharp creaks and pops, sounds that were entirely random and unpredictable. A creak might sound from the back panel, a soft, dry crack like the breaking of a tiny twig. A pop might come from the joint where the top of the case met the side, a sound that was sharper and more sudden. These sounds were not part of the clock's regular mechanical voice. They were the voice of the wood itself, the sound of the ancient, patient material adjusting to the slow, nightly shift in the world's temperature. They would occur at odd, unpredictable intervals, sometimes 2 or 3 in close succession, sometimes with long stretches of silence in between, and they added a layer of organic, living texture to the otherwise purely mechanical soundscape of the room. The clock was not just a machine, it was an object made of once living materials, and those materials still retained a faint residual memory of the forest and the seasons and the slow, steady growth of the tree from which they had been cut. On certain nights, when the fire in the kitchen stove had been allowed to burn a little brighter and the warmth had penetrated through the wall into the front room, the air in the room would be just warm enough to create a different effect. A small, almost invisible wisp of warm air would rise from the floor and pass across the front of the clock, disturbing the delicate balance of the pendulum's swing. The effect was minuscule, a variation of perhaps 1/1000th of an inch in the arc of the brass disc, but it was enough to produce a barely perceptible change in the sound of the ticking. The tick would be a fraction of a second late, or the tock would be a fraction of a second early, and the steady hypnotic rhythm would falter for a single beat before recovering its regular pace. This tiny irregularity was a reminder that the clock, for all its precision and reliability, was still a creature of the physical world, subject to the same subtle forces of temperature and air current and pressure that govern the flight of a milkweed seed or the drift of a dust mote in a sunbeam. It was not a perfect, platonic ideal of timekeeping. It was a small, intricate machine that lived in the same warm, dusty, imperfect room as you did, and it shared in the small, quiet fluctuations of that room's environment. The ritual of winding the clock was a task that was performed every evening, usually just before the lamp was lit, and the long, quiet hours of reading and resting began. It was a task that required a small, brass key, an object that lived on the mantelpiece beside the clock, resting on a small felt pad that had been cut from an old hat. The key was simple and functional, its handle a flat, oval loop of brass that had been worn smooth and shiny by countless fingers, its shaft a short, square rod that fit precisely into the winding arbors on the face of the clock. There were two arbors, two small, square holes in the white enamel dial, one for the time train and one for the strike train. The strike train had been disconnected years ago, the thin, coiled gong inside the case having been silenced because its loud, resonant chime on the hour-and-a-half hour was considered too jarring for the quiet of the house. So only the time train was wound, and the clock ticked on in its silent, unannounced way, marking the hours without comment. The act of winding was a slow, deliberate process. You would open the glass door of the clock, the small brass knob on the door cool and smooth under your fingers, and the door would swing outward on its tiny, precise hinges, making no sound at all. The interior of the clock was now exposed, and you could smell the faint, distinctive odor of the mechanism, a smell of old brass and fine machine oil and the dry, dusty scent of aged wood. It was a clean, pleasant smell, the smell of careful, precise workmanship. You would insert the key into the right-hand arbor, the one for the time train, feeling the slight, satisfying click as the square shaft engaged with the socket inside. Then you would begin to turn the key, slowly and steadily, in a clockwise direction. The winding was not a single, continuous motion, but a series of short, precise turns, the key advancing perhaps a quarter of a revolution, with each movement before the ratchet clicked and you repositioned your fingers for the next turn. The sound of the winding was a soft, mechanical clicking, a rapid series of small, sharp sounds that was entirely different from the slow, measured tick of the clock's normal operation. It was the sound of energy being stored, of potential being accumulated, of the mainspring being tightened coil by coil until it was a dense, compact reservoir of power. As you wound, you would listen to the changing sound of the clicks. When the mainspring was nearly run down, the clicks were slow and labored, each one requiring a bit more effort from your fingers. As the spring tightened, the clicks became faster and crisper, the key turning more easily, until finally, after a certain number of turns that you knew by feel rather than by count, the resistance increased sharply, and you knew that the spring was fully wound. You would stop immediately, never forcing the key beyond that point, because to do so would risk breaking the delicate mechanism. Then you would withdraw the key, close the glass door with the same careful, silent motion, and return the key to its felt pad on the mantel. The clock, now fully wound, would continue its steady ticking, its voice perhaps a tiny bit brighter, a tiny bit more energetic, for the first few hours after the winding. The ritual was complete, a small daily act of maintenance that ensured the continuity of the clock's voice and the measured, orderly passage of the night. When the fire in the kitchen stove was burning low, the faint orange glow of the coals would sometimes cast a small, wavering light through the open doorway and into the front room. This light was barely enough to see by, just a faint, warm luminescence that seemed to cling to the edges of things, and it would catch the polished surface of the pendulum as it swung back and forth behind the oval window. The pendulum would flash, a tiny, brief spark of reflected firelight that appeared at the extreme left of its swing, disappeared into the darkness of the case's interior, and then reappeared at the extreme right, a small, rhythmic pulse of light that was the visual counterpart to the auditory pulse of the ticking. The arc of the pendulum's swing was small, perhaps 1.5 inches from side to side, and the flash of reflected light was correspondingly brief, a tiny golden wink that lasted only a fraction of a second before vanishing. Watching this small, rhythmic light was a form of meditation, a way of synchronizing your own internal rhythms with the slow, steady pulse of the clock. You would sit in the armchair wrapped in the woolen afghan, and your eyes would find that tiny, moving spark in the darkness, and you would watch it swing back and forth, its motion as regular and as soothing as the rise and fall of a sleeping breath. The hours of the night passed in this way, measured by the ticking of the clock and the slow, gradual settling of the house into the deeper cold. The sound of the clock was a constant, reassuring presence, a thread of sound that ran through the darkness and held the night together. It did not demand attention or require a response. It simply was. A small, steady voice in the vast, silent darkness, a metronome that marked the slow, patient rhythm of a world at rest. And as you listened, your own breathing would slow and deepen, falling into an unconscious synchronization with the pendulum's swing, your heartbeat finding its place in the quiet, two-beat rhythm of the tick and the tock. The clock ticked on, indifferent to the sleeper and the waking, indifferent to the cold and the dark and the slow, silent drift of the earth through the empty spaces of the night. It ticked on, a small, mechanical heart beating in the dark room, measuring out the hours until the first pale light of morning would seep through the curtains and the world would begin again. The deepest part of the winter had settled over the town and the surrounding fields, with a stillness that was different from the quiet of the other seasons. It was a stillness that was not merely the absence of sound, but a positive presence, a thick, muffling blanket that seemed to absorb every noise before it could travel more than a few feet from its source. The snow had been falling off and on for the better part of a week, not in dramatic, wind-driven storms, but in a slow, steady, patient accumulation, a few inches one day, a few more the next, until the world outside the windows had been transformed into a soft, white, undulating landscape where the familiar shapes of the yard and the lane and the distant fence rows were smoothed and rounded and made strange. The snow muffled everything. The occasional distant bark of a dog was reduced to a soft, furry thump of sound. The rare automobile that passed on the main road a quarter of a mile away made no noise at all that could be heard from the house, its passage marked only, if you happened to be looking, by a faint, moving puff of white exhaust that was quickly swallowed by the grey sky. The world had been simplified, reduced to a few essential elements: the white ground, the grey sky, the dark, skeletal lines of the bare trees, and the small, warm pocket of the house that sat in the midst of it all, like a ship at anchor in a frozen sea. Inside the house, the cold was a constant, gentle presence that was held at bay by the steady, slow consumption of the dusty coal in the kitchen stove and by the layers of wool and flannel and quilt that enveloped every living thing. The front room, where the best of the pale, filtered light from the snow-covered yard found its way through the single window, was the warmest room besides the kitchen itself, and it was here that the long grey hours of the January afternoons were spent. The armchair was pulled a little closer to the source of warmth, though the warmth itself was more an idea than a physical sensation, a faint, radiating comfort that took the sharpest edge off the chill. The woolen afghan was a permanent fixture on the back of the chair, ready to be pulled over a lap or wrapped around shoulders at a moment's notice. The cat, if it was inside, had claimed the spot on the braided rug that was directly in line with the warmest air drifting through the doorway from the kitchen, and it lay there in a tight, compact loaf. Its orange fur fluffed out to twice its normal thickness, its eyes closed in a state of deep, immobile contentment. The only sound in the room, aside from the soft hiss and occasional click of the stove in the next room, was the steady, rhythmic tick and tock of the clock on the mantel, a sound that had become so familiar, so deeply woven into the fabric of the room's quiet, that it was no longer consciously heard, but simply felt, a small, reassuring pulse at the edge of awareness. It was on one such afternoon, when the light outside was a uniform, shadowless grey, and the snow was falling again in a slow, drifting curtain of small, dry flakes, that the arrival occurred. The arrival was not announced by any knock on the door or any sound of an automobile engine labouring through the drifts. The mail service to the houses on the edge of town had become sporadic and unreliable, dependent on the whims of the weather and the availability of a carrier whose own automobile could manage the unploughed lanes. Sometimes days would pass with no delivery at all, and then a small bundled packet of letters and circulars would appear in the metal box at the end of the lane, left there by some unseen hand at some unknown hour. This particular arrival was discovered during a brief foray to the woodpile, a quick, shivering dash through the shallow drifts to replenish the supply of kindling beside the stove. On the way back, your arms full of dry, splintery sticks of pine, your eyes had happened to glance toward the mailbox, a simple black metal cylinder on a wooden post that was now wearing a small white cap of snow. The red flag, the little tin indicator that signaled outgoing mail, was down, but there was a telltale bulge in the curved metal door, a sign that something had been pushed inside. The something was retrieved with cold, stiff fingers, the metal of the mailbox door screeching slightly as it was pulled open against the frost, and the object was carried inside along with the armload of kindling. The object was a catalogue. It was not a thick, glossy magazine of the sort that advertised automobiles and fashionable clothing and the other accoutrements of a life that seemed to exist in some parallel, brightly lit world far removed from the quiet, snow-bound house. It was a seed catalogue, a thin, paper-bound volume with a cover of bright, cheerful color that seemed almost indecently vivid against the gray and white of the winter landscape. The cover was a soft, pale yellow, the color of early spring butter, and it featured a hand-painted illustration of a basket overflowing with vegetables, each one rendered in a slightly exaggerated, idealized way that made them look more perfect and more desirable than any vegetable that had ever actually grown in real soil. The tomatoes were a deep, glossy scarlet, their skins taut and shining. The ears of corn were plump and golden, their yellow kernels arranged in neat, even rows and peeking out from beneath the pulled-back green husks. The carrots were a brilliant, unblemished orange, their feathery green tops crisp and upright. The image was surrounded by a border of stylized vines and tendrils, and across the top, in a cheerful, slightly old-fashioned serif font, were the words Burgess Seed and Plant Co., Annual Catalogue and Garden Guard. The paper of the cover was thin and slightly glossy, and it crackled softly when you handled it, a sound that was crisp and new and entirely out of place in the soft, muffled quiet of the winter room. You carried the catalogue to the armchair, brushing a few clinging flakes of snow from its cover, and you sat down, pulling the woolen afghan over your lap and tucking its edges around your legs. The light from the window was pale and grey, but it was enough to see by, enough to make out the bright colors and the small, dense type of the pages within. You opened the catalogue, and the spine made a faint, crackling sound as the cheap glue resisted the movement for a moment before yielding. The inside cover was a pale, creamy white, and it was printed with a long, earnest letter from the president of the company, a man whose name was printed in a flowing cursive script at the bottom of the page. The letter spoke of the promise of the coming season and the importance of careful planning and the superior quality of Burgess seeds, and it was written in a tone of cheerful, optimistic confidence that assumed as a matter of course that the reader would be planting a garden in the coming spring. You read the letter slowly, your eyes moving across the lines of small type, and you felt a small quiet stirring, a faint flicker of something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it, a sense of connection to a larger world where the soil was thawing and the seed houses were busy filling orders and the cycle of the seasons was continuing on its ancient, reliable course. The first pages of the catalogue were devoted to the most essential and the most humble of the garden's inhabitants, the root vegetables. There were pages of carrots, their names a small, quiet poetry of the earth. Danvers half-long, Chantenay red cord, oxheart, Nantenay red cord, oxheart, Nante. Each variety was accompanied by a small black and white line drawing of the vegetable in question, the carrot pulled from the soil and shown with its feathery top intact and its tapering orange root clean and smooth. The descriptions were brief and practical, noting the length and the color and the sweetness and the best soil conditions for each type, and they were written in a calm, informative tone that assumed a certain baseline of gardening knowledge. You read the description of the Danvers half-long, a reliable, all-purpose carrot that was tolerant of heavy soil and stored well through the winter, and you thought of the rows of dusty, limp carrots that had come from the sandbox in the cellar, and you imagined a new row, a fresh row, of bright, crisp orange roots pushing down into the dark, moist earth of the garden plot. The thought was a small, pleasant one, a tiny, private image of abundance and order, and it warmed you in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The pages turned slowly, one by one, the thin paper rustling softly with each movement. The beets came next, their names as rich and as dark as the color of their roots. Detroit, dark red; Crosby's Egyptian, early blood turnip. The illustration showed the beets in cross-section, revealing their deep, ruby-red flesh marked with faint, concentric rings, like the rings of a tree trunk or the contour lines on a map. You read the description of the Detroit dark red, a standard variety known for its uniform shape and its sweet, earthy flavor, and you imagine the beets boiling in a pot on the stove, their skins slipping off easily to reveal the tender, garnet-colored flesh beneath, and the vinegar and sugar and spices that would transform them into jars of pickled beets. The deep red color bleeding into the clear brine and turning it a beautiful, translucent magenta. The thought of those jars, lined up on the pantry shelf and glowing like jewels in the dim light, was a small, comforting vision of the future, a promise of color and flavor in the long, gray months to come. The radishes were next, their names quick and sharp and slightly comical: French breakfast, white icicle, cherry belle, scarlet globe. The illustrations showed them in bunches, their small, round or elongated roots in shades of pink and red and white, their green tops crisp and upright. You read the description of the French breakfast, an heirloom variety with an oblong shape and a pretty rose-pink color that faded to white at the tip, and you remembered the peppery, crisp bite of a radish pulled fresh from the cool spring soil and eaten out of hand with a small sprinkle of salt. The memory was so vivid, so sensory, that for a moment you could almost taste the sharp, clean heat on your tongue, and the contrast between that bright spring flavor and the cold, still air of the January room was almost startling. The pages continued to turn, each one a small window into a world of green and growing things. There were pages of lettuce, their names soft and leafy and evocative: black-seeded Simpson, a loose-leaf variety with crinkled, light green leaves that was known for its tenderness and its resistance to bolting; Butter Crunch, a butterhead type with thick, succulent leaves that formed a small, loose rosette of pale green and cream; Ruby, a red-leaf lettuce that added a splash of deep burgundy color to the salad bowl. You read the description of the black-seeded Simpson, a variety that had been a staple of kitchen gardens for generations, and you imagine the small black seeds, each one a tiny hard fleck of potential, being sprinkled onto a patch of finely raked soil and covered with a thin layer of earth, and the slow, miraculous emergence of the first tiny pale green sprouts a week or so later. The thought was a small, quiet act of faith, a belief in the invisible processes of germination and growth that would unfold beneath the soil in the warming days of spring. The beans were next, their names sturdy and reliable: Kentucky Wonder, a pole bean that would climb a rustic teepee of poles and produce long, fleshy, curved pods of a deep, rich green; Blue Lake, a bush bean that was known for its heavy yields and its stringless, tender pods; Black Valentine, an heirloom variety with slender, dark green pods and a rich, beany flavor. The illustration showed the beans in various stages, from the small white blossoms to the slender, immature pods to the mature, dried beans that would be shelled and stored in a glass jar for winter soups. You read the description of the Kentucky Wonder, and you thought of the tall, sturdy poles that would need to be cut and set in the ground, and the way the bean vines would twine around them, reaching upward toward the sun, their tendrils curling and grasping with a slow, vegetable intelligence. The image of that green, leafy teepee, standing in the corner of the garden plot and buzzing with bees on a warm summer afternoon, was a small, vivid antidote to the gray stillness outside the window. The corn was next, its names tall and golden: Golden Bantam, an old-fashioned sweet corn with small plump ears and kernels of a deep, buttery yellow; Stahl's Evergreen, a late-season variety that remained tender and sweet for an extended period; Country Gentleman, a shoe-peg corn with irregular rows of small white kernels that were exceptionally sweet and creamy. The illustrations showed the ears of corn in cross-section, revealing the neat, orderly rows of kernels, and the tall, stately stalks with their tassels of pollen and their silky ears. You read the description of the Golden Bantam, a variety that had been introduced decades ago and had become a favorite for its rich, old-fashioned corn flavor, and you thought of the hot, humid mornings of July when the corn would be at its peak, the stalks taller than a man's head, and the ears plump and ready for picking, and the simple, incomparable pleasure of boiling an ear of corn within minutes of pulling it from the stalk, and eating it with a pat of butter and a sprinkle of salt. The memory was so strong, so filled with the sensory details of warmth and sweetness and the faint green smell of the husks, that it seemed to push back against the cold that was seeping in around the window frame. The tomatoes came last, the crown jewels of the garden, their names a litany of summer abundance. Brandywine, an heirloom beefsteak with large, irregular, pinkish-red fruits and a rich, complex flavor that was the stuff of legend. Rutgers, a reliable all-purpose variety that was good for canning and slicing and everything in between. Yellow pear, a cherry tomato with small pear-shaped fruits of a bright sunny yellow that was salad yellow, that was sweet and mild and beautiful in a salad. The illustrations showed the tomatoes on the vine, clusters of red and gold and pink, their skins smooth and taut and glowing with an inner light. You read the description of the brandywine, and you could almost feel the weight of a ripe tomato in your hand, the slight give of the flesh under the skin, the way the warm, fragrant juice would run down your chin when you bit into it, standing in the garden with the sun on your back and the smell of the tomato vines, that peculiar, sharp green smell, clinging to your fingers. The contrast between that vivid sensory memory and the silent, white world outside was so stark that it was almost dizzying, a small, private vertigo of the imagination. There was no money to buy seeds. The coins in the white handkerchief in the back of the dresser drawer were needed for things that could not be grown or bartered or made at home. Things like a box of matches or a small bag of salt or a replacement for the lamp chimney if the old one should crack. The seed catalogue was not an order form. It was a different kind of document, a book of hours for a secular, agricultural faith, a breviary of color and potential and patient waiting. The turning of its thin, cheap pages was a small daily ritual during the long grey weeks of January, a way of marking the slow passage of the season and of keeping alive a small, quiet connection to the world of green and growing things that lay dormant under the deep, white blanket of snow. You would sit in the armchair, the catalogue open on your lap, and your eyes would travel over the bright illustrations and the calm, practical descriptions, and you would plan imaginary rows and beds and patches, arranging the vegetables in your mind's eye according to their needs for sun and space and water, rotating the crops from one year to the next, placing the tall corn on the north side so it would not shade the shorter plants, tucking the lettuce in the cool, partial shade of the bean teepee. It was a form of mental gardening, a slow, careful cultivation of the imagination, and it required no tools and no seeds and no money, only the quiet hours of a winter afternoon and the bright, improbable colors of the catalogue. The snow continued to fall outside the window, a slow, steady drift of small, dry flakes that accumulated on the sill and blurred the view of the yard and the empty field beyond. The world was white and grey and silent, a monochrome study in stillness and cold. But inside the catalogue, on the thin, cheap pages that crackled softly when they were turned, the world was a riot of colour and abundance, a promise of warmth and growth and the slow, steady turning of the seasons. The black-seeded Simpson lettuce and the Detroit dark red beet and the golden bantam corn and the brandywine tomato were not just vegetables. They were small, paper-bound emissaries from a future that was, for now, only a dream, a quiet, patient vision of a time when the snow would melt and the ground would thaw and the small hard seeds would be pressed into the dark, waiting earth. And as the grey light of the January afternoon began to fade and the room grew dimmer and the ticking of the clock seemed to slow and deepen, you would close the catalogue, its bright cover a small rectangular patch of yellow in the gathering dusk, and you would set it aside on the round table ready for the next afternoon, the next quiet hour, the next slow, meditative turning of its pages. The snow continued to fall, soft and silent and patient, and the house settled deeper into the quiet of the winter night, and the small, bright dream of the garden slept on, waiting for the spring. The change, when it came, was not announced by any sudden shift in the weather or any dramatic break in the long grey monotony of the winter sky. It arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, as a subtle alteration in the quality of the air and the sound of the world outside the window. For weeks, the predominant sounds of the outdoors had been the dry, brittle rustle of the frozen snow crust being stirred by a bitter wind and the sharp, cracking report of tree limbs contracting in the deep cold of the night. These were the sounds of a world locked in stillness, a world where moisture had become a rigid crystalline solid, and where the very breath of the earth seemed to have been held in suspension. But on a particular morning, a morning that looked at first glance much like all the mornings that had preceded it, there was a different sound. A sound that was soft and liquid and full of a quiet, patient movement. It was the sound of rain. The rain did not begin with a sudden downpour or a dramatic roll of thunder. It began as a barely audible whisper against the window glass, a sound so faint that you might have mistaken it for the settling of the house or the soft pad of the cat's feet on the floorboards. You were sitting in the armchair in the front room, the seed catalogue closed on the table beside you, its bright cover a small, familiar rectangle of yellow in the grey light, and you became aware of the sound slowly, the way one becomes aware of a faint, persistent hum that has been present for some time without being consciously noted. You lifted your head and looked toward the window, and you saw that the grey, featureless sky had lowered and softened, its texture changing from a smooth, uniform dome to a closer, more intimate veil of shifting vapor, and against the glass, leaving small irregular trails that caught the pale light, were the first tentative drops of rain. The sound of the rain on the roof was the next thing you noticed. It was a soft, continuous patter, a gentle, percussive murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the attic space above the ceiling and filtering down through the lath and plaster to reach your ears in the room below. It was not a loud sound, not an insistent sound, but it was a pervasive sound, a sound that wrapped itself around the house and seeped into every corner, replacing the deep, dry silence of the winter with a new kind of quiet, a quiet that was alive and moving and filled with the soft, liquid music of water. The sound rose and fell in subtle, irregular waves, a few moments of slightly heavier patter, followed by a longer stretch of gentle, steady drizzle, the rhythm dictated by the passing of unseen, soft clouds overhead and the shifting currents of the mild, damp air. It was a sound that invited stillness, that encouraged the listener to remain seated, to let the eyes rest on the window and the ears rest on the rain, and to allow the slow, steady passage of the minutes to occur without measurement or concern. As the morning wore on and the rain continued its soft, persistent work, the view from the window began to change. The deep, uniform blanket of snow that had covered the yard and the field beyond for so many weeks was no longer a smooth, unbroken surface. The rain, though gentle, was slightly warmer than the frozen ground, and it was eating away at the snow from above, creating small, shallow depressions and rivulets that traced wandering, irregular paths across the white expanse. The stark, sharp edges of the drifts that had piled against the fence and the base of the apple tree were softening, rounding, slumping into gentler, more gradual slopes. The snow was settling, compacting under the weight of the absorbed moisture, and its color was changing from the bright, reflective white of deep winter to a duller, grayer, more translucent shade, the color of old, melting ice on a pond. Here and there, where the snow was thinnest or where the ground beneath was slightly warmer, small dark patches of bare earth were beginning to appear, irregular islands of brown and tan in the retreating sea of white. The sight of that bare earth, the first glimpse of the actual ground after months of unbroken snow cover, was a small, quiet event, a signal that the long, frozen sleep of the land was beginning to end. The softening of the ground was a process that could not be seen directly from the window, but could be felt in the air and understood in the mind. The rain, soaking into the frozen surface, was slowly thawing the upper layer of soil, turning the hard, impenetrable crust of winter into a soft, yielding, saturated sponge. You could imagine the water seeping down through the tiny cracks and fissures that the frost had opened in the earth, filling the empty spaces between the particles of clay and sand and silt, waking the dormant, microscopic life that had been waiting in a state of suspended animation since the first hard freeze of autumn. The smell of this process, the smell of wet earth, was beginning to find its way into the house, seeping in through the tiny gaps around the window frame and under the back door, a rich, dark, mineral scent that was the fundamental odor of spring. It was a smell of deep, patient rot and slow chemical transformation, of last year's fallen leaves dissolving into humus and the tangled, dead roots of the garden weeds releasing their stored nutrients back into the soil. It was not a sweet smell or a floral smell. It was an earthy, elemental smell, a smell that spoke of the ground's slow, silent work of renewal, and it was the most welcome scent that had entered the house in many months. Your attention, drifting between the sound of the rain and the view of the changing snow and the faint, pervasive smell of the wet earth, would eventually settle on the distant line of trees that marked the course of the creek at the far edge of the field. The trees, which had been bare, black skeletons against the snow for as long as you could remember, were no longer simply dark lines against the white and grey. There was a change occurring among their branches, a change so subtle that it was almost more a feeling than a visual fact. It was a faint, hazy suggestion of colour, a pale yellow-green mist that seemed to hover around the tips of the twigs and the smallest, most distant branches. It was the first tentative haze of new growth, the swelling of buds that had been tightly closed and dormant all winter, and were now, in response to the lengthening days and the softening air, beginning to stir and expand. The colour was not a solid, definite green, but a spectral, translucent wash, like a watercolour painting left out in a light rain, the pigment bleeding softly into the wet paper. It was most visible on the willow trees that lined the banks of the creek, their long, slender, whip-like branches taking on a distinct yellowish cast, a colour that seemed to glow faintly against the grey sky and the retreating snow. The willows were always the first to show their colour, the first to respond to the subtle, invisible signals of the changing season, and seeing that faint yellow-green haze across the distant field was like receiving a quiet, long-awaited message, a confirmation that the slow, patient work of the earth was continuing on its ancient, reliable course. The rain continued through the afternoon, sometimes strengthening into a steady, driving shower that rattled the loose pane in the kitchen window and sent a stream of water gurgling through the downspout at the corner of the house, and sometimes fading into a soft, drifting mist that was barely more than a heavy, damp presence in the air. You moved through the house during these hours, attending to the small, quiet tasks that filled the day, and the sound of the rain was a constant, soothing companion. In the kitchen, you added a few small lumps of coal to the stove, listening to the soft hiss of the moisture in the fuel as it met the heat, and you stood for a moment by the back door, looking out at the yard. The snow was visibly retreating now, the bare patches of earth growing larger and joining together, and a small steady stream of meltwater was running down the slight slope of the yard and pooling in a shallow depression near the compost pile. The old, unused doghouse was emerging from its winter cocoon of white, its dark, weathered boards looking wet and heavy, and a small brave patch of green moss on its shaded north side was a startling, vivid colour against the brown and grey. In the front room, you paused by the window and looked out at the street. The pavement, which had been covered with a packed layer of ice and hard snow for so long, was now wet and dark, reflecting the pale grey light of the sky in a long, shimmering ribbon. The small, persistent tufts of grass and weeds that had pushed up through the cracks in the asphalt were visible again, flattened and sodden, but undeniably alive, their roots reaching down into the tiny reservoirs of moisture and soil that had accumulated in the fissures. The empty lot where the Peterson house had stood was a patchwork of melting snow and exposed brown earth, and the tall, dry stalks of the goldenrod and the sumac, which had stood like brittle, frozen sentinels all winter, were now dark and heavy with moisture, their heads bowed under the weight of the rain. The whole world outside seemed to be drinking in the water, absorbing it, waking up from its long, cold sleep with a slow, silent, collective thirst. The sound of the rain on the roof was the most constant and the most intimate of the day's sensations. It was a sound that created a small private world inside the house, a world that was separate from the larger, wetter world outside, but connected to it by the thin, percussive membrane of the roof and the walls. The rain was a roof over the roof, a second layer of shelter that enclosed the house in a soft, liquid cocoon. Inside that cocoon, the familiar sounds of the house were muffled and softened, the tick of the clock on the mantel seeming to blend with the patter of the rain, the occasional creak of a floorboard absorbed into the larger, ambient wash of sound. The light in the room was a soft, diffuse grey, the kind of light that erased shadows and softened edges and made the familiar objects of the room seem to float in a gentle, undifferentiated space. It was a light that encouraged stillness, that made the act of simply sitting and listening feel like a complete and sufficient activity. As the afternoon began to fade and the grey light outside deepened toward the darker grey of early evening, the rain showed no sign of stopping. It continued to fall, steady and patient, a soft, endless curtain of water that blurred the outlines of the distant trees and the fence posts and the familiar shapes of the neighboring houses. You would find yourself drawn back to the window, your gaze traveling out across the yard and the field, following the slow, subtle changes in the landscape as the last of the daylight drained from the sky. The faint yellow-green haze on the willow trees was no longer visible in the dimness, but you knew it was there, a small, quiet promise that had been made and would be kept. The smell of the wet earth was stronger now, rising from the softening ground and filling the air with its rich, dark mineral scent, a scent that seemed to be the very breath of the world exhaling after a long-held silence. On the back porch, just outside the kitchen door, there was a wooden rain barrel that had stood in the same spot for as many years as anyone could remember. It was a simple, functional object, made of cedar staves held together with galvanized steel hoops, and it had weathered to a soft, silvery grey that blended with the color of the weathered shingles on the house. The barrel was positioned directly beneath a corner of the roof where two sections of the eaves met, a spot where the rainwater from a large section of the roof was funneled and concentrated. During the dry months of summer and autumn, the barrel stood empty, its interior a dark, dusty hollow that smelled faintly of old wood and the ghosts of long-evaporated rain. But now, in the soft, steady rain of early spring, the barrel was coming back to life. The water from the roof gathered in the galvanized gutter, traveled along its slight, rusty slope, and spilled out of the downspout in a clear, cold stream that splashed into the open top of the barrel. The sound of this splashing was a smaller, more localized version of the sound of the rain on the roof, a bright, liquid, percussive note that was distinct from the larger, ambient patter. It was the sound of water being collected, being saved, being stored for the dry days to come, and it was a sound that had a satisfying, practical music to it. You would stand at the back door, the door open, just a crack to let in the cool, damp air and the sound of the splashing water, and you would watch the barrel slowly fill. The water level was invisible in the darkness of the barrel's interior, but you could gauge its progress by the changing pitch of the splashing sound. When the barrel was nearly empty, the water fell a long distance and struck the wooden bottom with a sharp, hollow thud. As the barrel filled, the distance the water fell grew shorter, and the sound changed, becoming softer, mellower, a gentle liquid plop rather than a sharp thud. Eventually, if the rain continued long enough, the barrel would fill completely, and the water would begin to overflow, spilling over the rounded top edge and running down the curved, silvery staves in a thin, glistening sheet, to be absorbed by the already saturated ground at the base of the barrel. That moment was still hours away, perhaps a day away, but the slow, patient progress toward it was a small, quiet drama being enacted just outside the door. The evening settled over the house with the same soft, gradual dimming of the light that had marked the morning's arrival. The rain continued to fall, its sound a steady, unwavering presence that filled the rooms and wrapped around every other sound, muffling and softening and blending. You lit the kerosene lamp in the front room, the small yellow flame springing to life behind the glass chimney and casting its warm, familiar circle of light on the armchair and the round table and the closed-seed catalogue. The catalogue would remain closed tonight. There was no need to look at the bright, improbable pictures of vegetables when the real, living promise of the season was falling softly outside the window, soaking into the earth, waking the dormant roots and the sleeping seeds. You sat in the armchair, the woolen afghan pulled over your lap more from habit than from any real need, and you listened to the rain on the roof, the splashing of the water into the barrel, the soft, liquid gurgle of the downspout, the faint, distant sound of the swollen creek running high and fast between its muddy banks. All of these sounds combined into a single, complex, soothing symphony of water. It was the sound of the world being washed clean, the sound of the long, cold silence of winter being rinsed away and replaced by the soft, murmuring voice of spring. The sound of the clock on the mantel, its steady tick and tock, was still there, a familiar underlying pulse beneath the watery music, but it seemed softer now, less insistent, as if the clock itself was relaxing into the gentler rhythm of the season. The house settled around you, its timbers and floorboards and plaster walls adjusting to the new, higher humidity, releasing small, soft creaks and groans that were immediately absorbed by the larger sound of the rain. The cat, if it was inside, was a warm, purring weight on your lap, its fur slightly damp from a brief, exploratory venture onto the back porch, its breathing slow and deep and perfectly synchronized with the steady patter on the roof. There was no resolution to this day, no conclusion to be drawn, no lesson to be learned. The rain fell and the ground softened, and the trees on the distant creek bank held their faint yellow-green haze of new growth against the grey sky, and the water dripped steadily from the edge of the roof into the slowly filling barrel. The world continued in its slow, patient turning, the season shifting from the stillness of winter to the quiet, burgeoning activity of spring, with a grace that required no announcement and no commentary. The house, with its single lamp burning in the front room, and its small, warm pocket of human and animal life, was a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast, wet, waking landscape, and that was a comforting thought. The rain would continue through the night, a soft, steady whisper against the window and the roof, and the house would settle into its own deep, quiet rest, its timbers relaxing, its foundation sinking ever so slightly into the softening earth, its inhabitants breathing slowly and peacefully, and the warm, dry darkness within. The water dripped from the eaves, a small, constant, liquid metronome marking the slow, steady passage of the night, and the world, for this one small moment in its long, ancient history, was at peace,